1.5 degrees, and at the end of the century, and carbon neutrality at the middle of the century. In fact, we are not in line, and we are in line with a figure which would be about the double of this figure, which means that we have to be much more active and very quickly. Therefore, the first issue is ambition and implementation. The second one is finance, because there's no possibility of moving forward without any new finance. There's the old story, but which still is present, of the $100 billion. It's quite a pity that we have not been able to reach this figure, and unfortunately I think it will not be reached here, but obviously it's a severe blow to the credibility of our action. But apart from this $100 billion per year objective, the recent report, which has been ordered by UK and Egypt, with Nicholas Stern in particular, showed that the 1,000 countries need much more, 10 times or 20 times more. And my guess is that it is the main objective of this COP. I'm not sure at all that we shall be able to move forward in that direction, but still it is an absolute necessity. It includes not only mitigation, adaptation, but loss and damage. The good thing is that for the first time we are really discussing about loss and damage, but there are no commitments. And it means that I would be happy if, at the end of this COP27, there will be new elements, serious elements, and not only reports for the future about the way to fill the gap between the needs of 1,000 countries and the financing possibilities. These are the two main points. The first one is enhancing the commitments, the famous NDCs, and we are far from there. The second one is finance, finance, finance. And I think that among the financial possibilities, there's our traditional idea of developing the carbon pricing, which is one of the tools that we must use. This is what I have said to our friend Sami Shukri, and seeing what is the beginning of this COP, I think these two issues remain the main issues.
Christophe Maglad, leading economist of the International Energy Agency. I have been struck by the tone of the last World Energy Outlook. How do you reconcile the major endeavors undertaken by the main emitters, the US, the EU, China, with the disappointing results in terms of global emissions? Nina?
I think, is it working now?
Yeah.
So, at the International Energy Agency, we always like to give lots of different numbers, and so I'd like talking a little bit about some of the numbers that we are seeing at the minute. As you mentioned, in 2021, there was a huge increase in global CO2 emissions, the largest ever increase we've seen in history. And emissions are also set to rise again in 2022 by about 1%. But what we should remember is that that increase in 2022 would have been an awful lot larger if we hadn't been deploying so many clean energy technologies over the past 5 or 6 years. We've heard about the importance of sticking to the 1.5 degree target, and absolutely much more ambition is needed to get there. But we should also remember how far prior to the Paris Agreement, the trajectory we were on for CO2 emissions would have led to global warming of about 3.5 degrees by the end of the century. Now, because of the Paris Agreement, technology changes there have been, on the basis of current policies that governments have put in place, we've shipped about 1 degree off that long-term temperature rise, so 2.5 degrees. So the big question is now, how can we go 1.5 degrees to 1.5 degrees? And here, we are seeing some action on the ground. In response to the global energy crisis, one of the things we have seen is advanced economies, in particular, really turbocharging their investment into clean energy technology. That is the US Inflation Reduction Act, EU Repower EU strategy, Japan's green transformation, big momentum behind wind and solar in China and in India. All of these things are really going to increase the amount of investment going into clean energy technologies. Today, I think we're about $1.3 trillion today in terms of clean energy technologies. And on the base of what governments have put in place, we will get that to $2 trillion. So a 50% increase over the next decade just because of the responses to the current energy crisis. That's a great move and a real step in the right direction. But to finish on 2 caveats to that. First of all, the increase that we are seeing is driven by advanced economies. We're seeing not enough investment into emerging market and developing economies, and this is where the finance aspects that we've heard are going to be so crucially important. Secondly, even if we have that increase to $2 trillion, it's not enough for getting us on track for net zero. For that, we need to be at $4 trillion by the end of this decade. So a tripling in clean energy technologies. So the energy crisis has had impacts, of course, on the fight against climate change, but we shouldn't think that it's all been purely negative. Governments are starting to step up and starting to bring about that boost in clean energy.
Thank you. Laurent, a reaction and the message?
Well, I totally agree with the figures and with the general idea. Now, from my point of view, the main question is concerning both the companies and the governments, and especially in the so-called rich countries, how to give incentives, maybe norms, and sometimes changing the horizon in order to invest more in new technologies and less in fossil fuel. That's the main question. It means that the whole financial system has to evolve. I mean, World Bank, IMF, central banks, multilateral banks, and so on and so forth. And there have been many reports. There has been a new proposal both by the Prime Minister of Barbados and by the French President in order to call a new working group. All that is excellent, but the real question is how to give new money and which will meet with the needs of the developing countries. And we must be very careful because this COP is an African COP, not only an African COP, but particularly an African COP. And if we are not in a position really to deliver on this, and in this precise COP, in these 2 weeks, if we are not in a position to give details and commitments about the way to fill the gap, you could have a very strong reaction, a negative reaction. And you have observed, like me, a new phenomenon. In Paris, a few years ago, we have all the African countries with us when we were saying, okay, we must try to avoid fossil fuel resources and to go directly to new technology, renewables. But now many countries, several countries of African countries, are having a different language, and I fully understand them. They say, okay, you have promised new money. The money didn't come. Therefore, we are in a position to use gas, to use oil, because we need that. We cannot always say to our population, wait for the rich countries. And therefore, we have to be very careful. We have to deliver right now, or in a very near future, new financing, which could be accessible to developing countries.
Thank you, Laurent, for joining us. Adair Turner, the founder and co-chair of the Energy Transition Commission. Could you bring your own contribution to the debate how to bridge the gap between what is done and what should be done? Please, Adair.
I think when we look at the progress of the last year, and I think it relates a bit to the contribution earlier, we actually see considerable progress in China, in Europe, and in the US through the Inflation Reduction Act. And I would say if you put those together, I am now more confident than I was before that each of those major economies will meet the commitments that they made for 2030. China will peak before 2030. The EU will achieve the objectives of Fit for 55 and Repower EU, etc. But we have two challenges. Although those major countries will meet those commitments were never big enough, because even those commitments involve using up a lot of the remaining carbon budget. And let's remember, we talked about a 500 gigaton carbon budget 2020 to 2050. Well, there's about 420 of that left because we've had 2 years at 40 gigatons. So we have to start turning that curve pretty quick to make a difference. Outside those major developed countries, I don't think we are seeing enough action, and that relates a lot to the financial flows. And the thing I would say is that we have to distinguish two different categories of financial flows that are required. One, and it is order of magnitude $1 trillion a year by the late 2020s, is investment in developing countries, which is investment. It is investment which, as long as the cost of capital is low enough, will give a rate of return. This is investment in renewables, for instance, in Africa, where the current level of investment in renewables is pitifully low in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this is not a gift, it's not a transfer, but it does need to be much larger in quantity, and it needs to lower the capital cost. Our analysis shows that in most of sub-Saharan Africa, if the cost of capital was the same as it was in Europe, or even the same as it was in India, it would be absolutely clear that wind and solar was the cheapest way to deliver electricity to the mass of African people who don't yet have it. But as long as the cost of capital is high, it does make sense to build a fossil fuel-based system. So we've got to unleash that quantity, and we've got to reduce the cost of capital, and this relates to the whole of what Laurent has referred to earlier, the Vera Songway-Nick Stern report, which has come out about mobilizing the MDBs, mobilizing much more money at a positive but still reasonable cost of capital. The other thing, however, which I would identify, and it is order of magnitude a few hundreds of billion, not a trillion, is the money which is required to enable some emerging economies to do things which do not yet make economic sense. And that is things like closing down existing coal mines, coal plants, before they would reach the end of useful life. And I think we have to accept that in relation to that, smaller quantity but vitally important, there has to be an element of a grant, of a transfer, of an absolute economic support in order to do something which doesn't yet make sense. So we need to focus on both those categories of financial flow. The latter one, where's it going to come from? Does it come from aid budgets? Does it come from philanthropy? Does it come from carbon credits? But we need to recognise that vitally important but smaller figure, as well as the really big numbers, which is about investment which can be good as long as we can increase the scale of financial flows, both official and private, and as long as we can reduce the cost of capital in those parts of the world where it is currently prohibitively high.
Thank you. With Simon Monday, the moral money editor of the Financial Times, we will deal with a different perspective, which is moral suasion. Simon, what could be the efficiency of this approach, which is related to the day-to-day life of everyone, to bridge the gap?
Yeah, this is such an important part of the conversation, isn't it? Because democracies, and indeed actually countries that are not democracies, are really limited in what their governments can do without popular support. And I think at the moment, obviously, in my country, the UK, across pretty much all developed countries, there's concern at the moment about the cost of living, inflation, rising energy costs. And so in that environment, it's quite difficult to marshal popular support for the kind of things that we're talking about here, greater assistance to developing countries, ramped up government investment and incentives for clean energy at home and abroad. It's difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. I think humans are fundamentally, people say humans are selfish. Yeah, somewhat selfish, but humans are also somewhat generous. And there's a deep natural instinct towards generosity within people also. And at the core of this, something we've been hearing more and more about over the past few days, is this fundamental moral dilemma, which is that climate change is something which is disproportionately driven by the richer nations and the impacts disproportionately suffered by poorer nations. And very few of us deep down think that's fair or okay. So I think there is the potential to really marshal popular support for this sort of intervention if we can make a clear case for how this money is going to be invested, make it clear that it will drive genuine gains for development of developing countries and also for the global climate. I think there are clear ways to make those arguments. And I think just following up on something that Adair said, I think the role of the World Bank here in particular and other multilateral institutions has to be absolutely crucial. It's absolutely correct that the cost of capital is far too high for investment in green energy and other projects in developing countries. And frankly, I think the World Bank in itself, as probably the most important multilateral institution, really needs to lead the way in unlocking those flows of capital. And I hope that we'll see more of that in the coming months.
Thank you. Adair, I come back to you. May I ask you to present the so-called sectoral approach, which involves business more actively in the fight against global warming, which could be completed, by the way, with sectoral carbon markets acting as a stick and carrot. Adair.
I think when we look at sectors, a particularly interesting group are those which 5 years ago many people, and we at the Energy Transition Commission, called the hard-to-abate sectors. Sectors like steel, cement, chemicals, aviation, shipping. And it's true that 5 years ago, if you'd gone to any of those sectors and asked them what they could achieve by 2050, a lot of them would have said, they'd have pulled a long face, and they'd have said it's incredibly difficult, we're difficult sectors, the technologies aren't yet available, maybe we can get a 50% reduction, and then if you want us to get to zero, we'll have to plant a lot of trees, do a lot of offsets. One of the great breakthroughs of the last 5 years, and we began at the Energy Transition Commission to drive this with a report that we produced in 2018 called Mission Possible. One of the great breakthroughs is the realization that even in these hard-to-abate sectors of the economy, we can get very close to absolute zero by 2050, and we can get to net zero with 90 or 95% of the reduction being in the sectors themselves, and only the last 5% by offsets. I would draw for your attention, for instance, that ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Authority, 2 weeks ago set a net zero by 2050 target. If anybody had told you 5 years ago that was going to happen, and that IATA, the International Air Transport Association, was going to be urging ICAO to do that, they'd have asked what you were smoking. That was outside the realm of the possible. So look, we know how it is technologically possible to get all of these, and within what's called the Mission Possible Partnership, we are now publishing detailed roadmaps of these. But some of them need help from public policy. Let's take steel. Steel is one of those sectors where initially it will be more expensive to go down the green route. The green route might be based on hydrogen rather than coking coal. Eventually that may be economic, but initially it will be more expensive. So you need carbon prices to bridge the gap between the old dirty technology and the new clean technology to deal with what people call the green premium. And this is where it relates to the global carbon pricing regime. Yes, in an ideal world, it would be great if we all agreed global carbon prices, at least applying to these internationally traded sectors, like shipping, like aviation, like chemicals, like steel. But if we can't yet get that, it has to be legitimate for particular regions such as the EU to go ahead with a carbon price and then to impose what's called a border carbon adjustment from imports from countries which do not yet impose that. However, I would suggest two things, two final crucial things. The purpose of this is not to raise money, and the purpose of this is not to be protectionist. The purpose is to encourage other countries also to impose their own carbon prices. And one thing I would suggest, which links to our argument earlier, our debate earlier, one thing I would suggest that the EU might do in order to signal that intent is to make clear that all the revenues raised by a border carbon adjustment will be devoted to the sort of financial flows to the developing countries that we've been talking about earlier. And I think that would be a very good sign that this is not intended to be a protectionist measure. This is all about making a contribution to the decarbonisation of these vital, hard-to-abate sectors such as steel, encouraging everybody else to join in, and if there are revenues that come from that, sending them back to the developing countries to help them to decarbonise.
Thank you, Adair. I know that you are leaving. Thank you.
Very much, Ed.
You are welcome. Now we jump to the second part of the conversation, which deals with the energy crisis and climate. Christophe Maglad, the energy crisis has had a major impact on the fight against global warming. Some do not hesitate to criticize the policies against global warming for underinvestment in supply. Others answer that it is the underinvestment in supply. It's not underinvestment in supply in oil and gas, which is the problem, but the underinvestment in renewable. Another question is the energy crisis as a boost or a setback for the energy transition. So, Christophe, could you answer these two questions, please?
Certainly, thank you very much. On your first question, we need to be very clear about what has caused the current energy crisis. There are many people around the world who have been very quick to blame clean energy policies and clean energy technologies for the current crisis. And we need to be very clear that that is incorrect. The cause of the crisis was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Whenever we speak with governments today, they're all very, very clear. They wish they had invested even more into clean energy technologies, into wind, into solar, and especially into energy efficiency. If they had done that, then the impacts of the crisis would have been so much less. And then your second question on whether the crisis will be a help or a hindrance, I mentioned already this turbocharging in investment that we are seeing because of the policies that governments have announced. And to put that into context, what it would mean, if we do see that investment up to $2 trillion by the end of this decade, what that would lead to is a peak in total fossil fuel demand by 2030. This would be a truly historic moment for energy markets. Since the Industrial Revolution, GDP has grown in line with fossil fuel use, and fossil fuel use has always been above 80% of total energy demand. If we see that peak in fossil fuel demand, that would mark the first time we see a break between GDP growth and fossil fuel demand. So it really would be a change in the way that the world supplies its energy. And while that's very good news, once again, it's not enough. A peak in fossil fuel demand will not get us on track with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and particularly not in line with 1.5 degrees. We need to see a peak and very, very strong decrease. Coal has to fall by about, in terms of unabated coal, 99%. Gas has to fall by about 75%. Oil has to fall by about 75% if we are to achieve our shared climate goals. So it's great that we are seeing these clean energy policies, but we should really continue to boost this and boost the ambition to make sure that we reduce fossil fuel demand at the pace that's needed.
Thank you. Thank you. Julien Perez, the Vice President Strategy of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. I will ask you to answer the dilemma of the oil and gas industry, which appeared very clearly during the energy crisis, still there, to satisfy the needs of the people and the firms for oil and gas with a new energy mix. So could you?
Yeah, sure. So it's true that this crisis has revealed that the transition has to comply with the sustainability and the goals that Christophe just depicted in terms of decline of the fossil fuel and increase of the new system. But at the same time, it's also revealed that it's important to keep in mind that the security and the affordability of energy, and particularly for developing nations. And for instance, the ripple effect of the Russia invasion in Ukraine has dramatic consequences beyond Europe. Of course, Europe is the first impacted, but there is a lot of ripple effect that comes along as well on the production of food and different things. So the positioning and the way that we try to engage the oil and gas industry to decarbonize and to move away from their legacy business is to try to engage them and build up on their capacity to deploy new technologies, their historical presence in many countries, their armies of engineers, obviously, that they have everywhere, and try to leverage on their skill sets and their capacity, their financial capacity as well, to finance this new system. I think one thing that has been unfortunately not sufficiently highlighted in the debate so far, I mean the global debate, not the debate today, but the global debate, is how we're going to switch the demand. Because it's not only a good thing to switch off the fossil fuel production and to produce clean energy, but you have to have a demand side as well that is managed to electrify the demand, to move away from historical molecules to new molecules, have a mix of electrons and molecules that could satisfy a growing demand, and just electrifying it. And I think that's something that we have been dramatically under-investing in, and that we definitely need to double down efforts. So doubling down efforts on clean technology, absolutely, but also do not forget the demand side and the energy efficiency, which has been like the missing, topic for quite a while and for too long. I think the other thing as well is that Laurent Fabius reminding us that this COP has been in Africa for the first time since 6 years, since Durban. I think it's good for us as well to listen. It's time for Europe and US to stop and listen. What are the developing nations are asking for? What are their capacity? What are their needs? And how they can decarbonize? And should Europe and US do more to give more time for Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America to deploy their decarbonization pathway? Because we cannot impose from Europe and US something that it could be unacceptable for the developing nation. And ultimately also I would like to highlight one thing is that the oil and gas industry generally, circumvene to the big names, the international oil companies that everybody knows. But actually the big bulk of the market is driven by the national companies. And here the difficulty that those countries and companies face is that it's not only a matter of providing energy, but it's also a matter of equilibrating the balance sheet of the government in which they pertain, because the revenue of the oil and gas industry is equilibrating quite a number of their government budget. So here, the challenge is even more tricky, and engaging and listening to those companies and what they can do to deploy those technology in their country is quite critical to me.
Thank you, thank you. Now, the floor will be to Xu Wa-King, who is the Director General of the National Center for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation for China. I would ask him to tell us about the impact of the energy crisis on the energy mix in his country, in China.
Okay, thank you, sir. It's my pleasure to attend this signed event. And with regard to these issues or questions, I take this opportunity to talk about three my personal understandings. And first of all, I would like to recall our goals. 2 years ago, President Xi Jinping was announced to the international community that China will increase its NDC, adopt strengthening policy and measures, strive to reach the peak of the carbon dioxide emissions before 2030, and strive to achieve carbon neutrality also before 2060. So here I would like to emphasize two befores, not by, before 2030 and before 2060. And President Xi also clearly stated that the epidemic has inspired us that mankind needs self-revolutions to accelerate the green development and lifestyle, and build ecological civilization and a beautiful earth. And secondly, I would like to say that the energy crisis has not only brought a huge impact on the European energy security strategy, it also poses great challenges to the existing climate policy in Europe. This is why the energy security should be found in its own hands, and also how to handle the relationship between the long-term climate strategy objectives and the near-term energy supply tactics. This lesson and cost have found a reason for China to further rely on coal for energy supply in the near term, in the near future. This is the so-called blast effect on coal, and the stabilizing role of coal electricity in China. We so-called the coal, and the coal electricity is very important. It may also delay the mission to some extent. I personally understand why. The reason behind it is very simple. European is advanced for every country, not only for China, but also for other countries. We learn more from the European experience and exercise. The third one I would like to say is 2 years later, the energy crisis has once again inspired us that human beings need an energy revolution and accelerate the formation the clean, low-carbon, safe, and efficient energy system, and adhere to the principle of building before breaking. 3B, building before breaking. it's a very important principle in China when we to take a policy and measures and actions. And the gradual withdrawal of fossil fuel energy must be based on the safe and the reliable substitution of new energy. And accelerate the planning and the construction of new energy system and ensure energy security while emission reductions and also ensure the normal life of the people. So this is my personal understanding the impact of energy crisis for China. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for this informative presentation. Now, to Mark van Kelen, who is the ambassador at large for climate diplomacy at the EU, I would like to raise the same question, but for the EU. How the EU is dealing with the energy crisis, mainly through Repower EU, in all its dimensions. There is coal in it. There is coal, but there is not only coal. There is renewable. So thank you. Mark.
Thank you, Monsieur Alfondieri. As was already said, we are now in the midst of an energy crisis which has been caused by the Russian invasion in Ukraine. In 2021, we were dependent for 155 billion cubic meters of or on Russian or imports from Russia of natural gas. The first couple of months, the imports went ahead normally. Now the flow has been reduced by 80%. So we have to deal with this. 155 billion cubic meters was 40% of the gas consumption in the European Union. The Repower EU program of May of this year provides an answer to this challenge. First of all, we're going to accelerate the rollout of renewables. We had in the Fit for 55 program a target of 40% renewables in terms of electricity generation in 2030. We're now going to raise that to 45%. Similarly, we're going to raise our ambition with regard to energy intensity. In Fit for 55, the target was to have an increase of our, or a lowering of our energy intensity by 9% between 2020 and 2030. Now we're going to go for 13 to 15% of energy intensity improvement. But we also have, in the short term, to go and buy gas elsewhere. We cannot completely stop consuming the gas we used to get from Russia. We have to buy it elsewhere, which is what we're doing. But let us be clear, there's going to be a steep decline in the consumption of gas in the European Union. Some people say, you're saying one thing, you're doing another. No, not at all. We are staying the course. We're staying the course. We're going to cut down gas consumption. We're going to buy a bit on world markets because we cannot substitute immediately, but that is the plan. We're also going to improve the production of biogas, the production of clean hydrogen, and we're going to further clean up the industrial sectors so that they also will rely less on fossil fuel consumption. So that, in a nutshell, is what we're going to do. The invasion of the Ukraine has led to an acute energy crisis, but it will accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. Let there be no doubt about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Now the floor will be to Dora Benedek, who is the Chief of Climate Policy Division at the IMF. For a question which I must say as an economist is extremely complicated. How do you integrate not only the short-term impact of the energy crisis and the evolution in the short run in your outlook, your perspective, and your work, but in the long run, very, very difficult, but very, very important. There is underestimation everywhere in all the countries of the world of the impact. And it's very difficult to because it depends on the assumptions, but anyhow, it's important. So thank you for your answer.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and talk to you. So, as we have heard, we are in a really difficult global environment. The world economy has been hit by shock after shock. We had COVID, then Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and at the same time, we also see the physical consequence of climate change across the world in all different regions. So as a result, in our last projection for the World Economic Outlook at the IMF, we actually revised down our global growth projection from 6% in 2021 to about 3.2% for 2022. And we still see a lot of downside risks in the future years. At the same time, we see high fuel prices, and this doesn't only have a consequence for energy prices, but of course, high energy and fuel prices pass through to the cost of every other commodity and good. So as a result, we see the rising food prices, and we see the rising energy prices, which together put a lot of hardship, especially on the most vulnerable households across the globe. So again, looking at the macro variables, we see a really high inflation this year, peaking above 9% later in the year. And even, in years further down, we see a really elevated level of inflation. But at the same time, we think the energy crisis, at least in case of Europe, this is not a transitory shock. This is something that will need to be addressed in the long term. And at the IMF, we think long-term consequences really depend on the policy reactions and the policy response that is given to the current situation. So let me say a few words about the policy response that we would recommend, or the way we see it at the IMF. So first of all, in the short term, in the immediate reaction, we think that reactions should be well targeted and they should be temporary. So they should really prioritize helping the most vulnerable households and businesses in the short run. We also need reforms that will help address climate change and the challenges related to climate change, because if we do not address this issue, obviously the long-term consequences, both in a macroeconomic and in a financial stability sense, will be really severe. We think that in the long term, price signals will be really essential. So we talked about carbon pricing already, but we think this has a really important role, because having the right price signals will really be the key to curb energy demand and stimulate supply. But at the same time, what we see from many countries is that the policy reactions are really different from what we would find ideal. We see the subsidies re-emerging in many countries, untargeted subsidies like across the board, price controls, again, superficially pushing down prices. And these actually are really costly in a fiscal sense. So budgets need to pay a lot for these measures, but they also lead to excess demand and undersupply. So they create the superficial wedge between demand and supply in the energy market. So fiscal policy, in our view, should instead really focus on helping the most vulnerable, having targeted subsidies rather than these across-the-board really costly measures. But we also know that energy prices will recede. They will start coming down over time, and I think it's important that we have policies ready for that. We should be ready to introduce a predictable and steadily increasing carbon price at the time when energy prices start coming down. We have talked about this. You all know that it is really vital to limit the temperature rise to this 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. But that requires cutting emissions by 25 to 50% by 2030 compared to the 2019 level. With the current climate policies that we have in place, You started in your introduction that that would cut emissions by 13%. Our projection is even lower. We currently think the current policies would cut emissions by 11%. So there's a really huge gap between what would be required and what current policies are promising in terms of achievement. I think it's also important to acknowledge that there is also a gap between what is being promised and what is actually being implemented. So we have a big gap in ambitions, but we also have a big lag in the implementation of the national plans. So we at the IMF, we think that introducing a $10 per ton carbon price in 2022 and gradually raising it to $75 by 2030 would be sufficient to close this gap between what we need to achieve by 2030. So just to sum up, the ideal policy mix, I think what we need in the long run, that would include a carbon price. That includes the elimination of current fossil fuel subsidies, which is a really important part of the package. There could be alternative measures that can also help achieve the equivalent outcome, and I think we need to be quite pragmatic about that. And at the same time, it's really important to keep in mind assisting vulnerable households, but this should be done in a really targeted and cost-efficient way. So we don't distort energy prices and we use the available resources in the best possible way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Simon, the following question about the book you wrote just before the energy crisis. It was published just before the energy crisis, and it dealt with how to cope with climate change around the world. A very, very serious question, by the way. So my question is, given that the energy crisis has compounded the gravity of this problem, if you had to write your book today, what would be changed?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I was speaking to somebody here at COP27, and we were talking about who is the person who has made the biggest difference to accelerate the energy transition. And this person I was speaking to said, Vladimir Putin. And I said, I think you may be right in the long term, in all seriousness, that this terrible invasion of Ukraine and everything that's followed from it, we can never be in any way grateful for such a terrible thing. But I do think it's true that in the long term, it will have a profound effect, as we've been hearing from other speakers, in accelerating the energy transition. So in the book that I wrote, there were three things that I really tried to get across. One was the incredible urgency of the crisis that we face. I visited communities where people are being smashed to bits by the impacts of climate change in places from Ethiopia to Bangladesh to the Solomon Islands to Nicaragua. In so many places, we talk 2050 or 2100, people are losing their homes, their livelihoods, their lives right now. That was one very important point. But the second point is just how much capacity and potential we have to address this. You hear saying and defeatist talk. There is a huge amount to be done, and some of the people that I met during the course of the book were doing extraordinary things in technology, in public policy, in all sorts of areas, which I found utterly inspiring in many cases. But the third thing that I always talk about, which I also got from the book, is just how difficult and challenging this is going to be. It's urgently needed. We have huge potential to do much better than we're doing, but it's going to take a hell of a lot of hard work.
Thank you, Simon. Now we step to the last part of this conversation, which is the reduction of carbon emission. If the forecasts in terms of carbon emissions are bleak, the last UN estimate of the gap to abide by 2% is 15 billion tons of CO2, and to abide by 1.5 degrees, it is 24 billion tons. This is certainly a huge amount, but if there was concerted action globally, not only to deal with carbon emission, but also with the energy mix, we could hope avoiding a major tragedy for mankind. Such an action plan should be based on the mobilization of firms which emit carbon. To this effect, a market for carbon could be the incentive to lead the firms to make the necessary investment to retrofit their plants. And I would like, through the questions, to have the reaction of some of the participants to this conversation. I will start with Anne van Isendijk, who is Vice President of Government Affairs and Environment at ArcelorMittal. I will ask her her reaction to the incentives to lead firms in the steel industry to phase out carbon emissions.
Thank you very much. I don't know, can you hear me? So just to provide a little bit of context, in addition to what Adair already mentioned, steel is globally responsible for 7 to 8% of CO2 emissions for the moment. So this is of course bad news. The good news is that steel is infinitely recyclable, and as you heard already before, there are technologies to achieve a zero carbon footprint. So there is hope. That makes it a material of choice to help the global economy to decarbonize and enable governments and customers and investors to achieve climate commitments. It basically has to play a very vital role in building a low carbon world. However, we heard already, decarbonizing steel industry is still quite complex. Most sites have multiple furnaces, downstream activities, and they all are situated in very specific locations with dependence or access to various energy sources, and not all can be decarbonized at the same time, and often requires a combination of different technologies, which is really important to understand. But also, the other thing is, decarbonizing the steel industry is very expensive. We heard, so on the one hand, it requires very significant investments, but also on the other side, as Adair also mentioned, operating green technologies in steel will most likely, for a certain amount of time, be more expensive than running the existing technologies. Also because we will need a very absolutely phenomenal amount of renewable energy. We heard the EU is investing a lot into it, which is great, but it needs to come very quickly. So what is needed for the industry, for the steel industry? The answer, again, is a bit complex. So in Europe, and we heard it quite a lot here, the belief is what we need above all is a high carbon price to be incentivized to invest. So, however, a high carbon price alone does not work, and we heard this already as well. And why? Well, mainly because Europe is not alone. Europe is not an island, and steel is a globally traded commodity, and it is really, really important that people keep that in mind. So Europe stands more or less alone for the moment in its approach to rely primarily on high carbon price. So, of course, it is true that if we had one system and one carbon price, that would probably be the solution, that would work. But we are very far away from that. And I think the gaps are even widening for the moment in terms of regional approaches, how to incentivize decarbonization, and that is a problem. So the risk is that such differences will rather hinder than push for a better globally decarbonized world. And that is important to know, because deindustrializing one region of the world will only push investment somewhere else where constraints are less. So that is of course not a solution. So what I said is, so what we need in Europe, we heard this also from Adair, that you need to probably combine, well, you need to combine the high carbon price with other incentives. So you need financial support, you need an effective carbon border adjustment measure, and you need lead markets for sustainable steel. But what I said is the gaps are widening. So what we are saying today is, and we heard this already, on the one hand, it's a very, very positive thing that there is the IRA pushing for huge amount of further investments. But of course, that means again a widening gap in terms of regional approaches. So you have again the EU policy based mainly on increasing carbon price, intending to push emitters towards decarbonization. And also, to be fair, there are state aid, there's financial support available, but it's very complex, it's restrictive, it's not always very foreseeable how you get and when you get the investment support. And then on the other side, you have the US where there's no carbon cost, and there is a huge amount of money now thrown into the system, which is, as I said, is a good thing for the climate. But you have to always bear in mind that there is a global world and there's global trade. And so regional gaps that are widening is not very good in the sense. So that means, again, we probably need new tools, again, additional tools in regions to adjust and make sure that there's a level playing field between the regions.
Okay, Mark van der Kelen, what about the European carbon border adjustment mechanism already dealt with by Adair, Anne, but you are an expert, please.
Well, following up on what was just said, our system of reducing emissions in the industrial sector is primarily built on our cap and trade. We have been doing this now for almost 20 years. It has been our main workhorse to get emissions down. The cap and trade works very well. Every year the cap goes down by 2.1%. In Fit for 55, that cap will be lowered by more than 4% a year. But there is the issue of carbon leakage, as was just mentioned. So the external quid pro quo of our emissions trading scheme is CBAM. CBAM levies or introduces a carbon levy at the border in function of the carbon embedded in the product that you're importing. We believe that CBAM is fully WTO compatible because we do not discriminate between European producers and foreign producers, and we do not discriminate between foreign producers. This is not directed at countries, it is directed at products. And our system will reflect the ETS that we have in the European Union. If countries have their own carbon pricing system, all right, we will provide a discount for that, in as much as the importer can demonstrate that he or she has been paying a carbon levy during the production of the good that is now being imported in the European Union. We're even exempting countries from the levy if they have a system which is basically identical to ours, like Norway and Switzerland. We are talking to other countries for them to introduce carbon pricing, which we believe is the future, but there has got to be also this dimension of the level playing field. And as was said by Adair, the ideal world would be that the CBAM would generate zero income, because then all others would have a system of carbon pricing which would be very similar to ours. But as long as that is not there, we need a CBAM. It was a controversial idea 2-3 years ago. The idea is now rapidly gaining currency in the world. We need an ETS. If you ask 100 economists, 99% will say you need carbon pricing. But if not the whole world is doing carbon pricing, for environmental and competitiveness reasons, you need to have the quid pro quo, which is a carbon levy at the border.
Okay, thank you very much. Julien Perez, what about market incentive to phase out methane emission in the oil and gas?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Edmond. Well, first of all, just to say that we do believe as well that carbon price is absolutely critical to happen at the fastest and the highest pace. In terms of the methane emission, so just to echo what I was sharing before, when it comes to the oil and gas industry, you have the IOCs and the NOCs, and it's important to keep that in mind because that's a very important aspect. And the methane emission for the oil and gas industry is a big issue. If you take the direct emission from the oil and gas industry, it's roughly 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. Half of it is coming from methane emissions during the production and the distribution of the gas mainly. So methane is gas, right? It's natural gas. And it's leakage most of the time. So 2 gigatons are coming from that. And today we have the technology to fix that very, very quickly. So as OGCI, we have invested in startups that are detecting and mitigating methane emission across the world. We deploy them, and we know it works. And so we can prove it. We can prove it works. So now our next iteration is to engage the oil and gas industry and to push them to aim for zero methane emission as quickly as possible. And we have set a time horizon at 2030. So we have launched this initiative in March, which is to change the mindset of the industry and to tell them now the technology are available, switch your mindset and aim for zero, as you do for safety. You have a zero fatality goal, you have a zero oil spills goal, you have now a zero methane objective. So from time to time, methane release may happen because you need to maintain the integrity of your installation, you have an overpressure, you need to release methane. That can happen. But otherwise, the mindset has to change, and we know that this industry is capable to do a lot when this mindset happens. So we do believe that this methane emission can be fixed very quickly, and that all methane emission from the oil and gas industry can and should be avoided. And this is where as well leveraging on the long-term presence of the industry in multiple countries could be a very good lever to activate, because it's not only a matter of having this wish of zero methane, you have to deploy the technology. And to deploy the technology, you have to have the people in place in the countries knowing how to manipulate this technology and to maintain it. So this is where we want to as well engage the oil and gas industry to lever on their capacity to deploy that solutions at scale and at pace in every single countries. And to give you just maybe one example, earlier this year we launched a satellite data acquisition in Iraq, because this is one country where we know that there is a lot of methane emission, but nobody really know how much is leaking. So we capture methane leakage from satellites every two times every week for 1 year, informing the local operator and telling him, well, you have a methane leakage here, how can we help you to fix it? And in some cases, it was just, oh, actually we have let this valve open. I'm serious. Those leakages were really big, and the marginal abatement costs to fix this is just ridiculously low. So addressing the methane emission from the oil and gas industry is the first top priority for us, because also it defines what is the speed of change of the climate change. We know that roughly half of the global warming, that we're experiencing today is coming from methane. So let's fix this methane emission from the oil and gas industry. It could be used, and the technology could be used for other sources, like waste field, landfill, etc. But the oil and gas industry has a key role to play here.
I remind you that there will be this afternoon an event co-organized by the International Chamber of Commerce and the Chinese International Finance Forum on methane. So you are invited to join.
Yeah, please join.
And many of you will participate to the debate. Xu Wang King, a question which is very important, raised by many people, given the size of the coal thermic plants in China. Would it be imaginable to retrofit the coal-fired plants with CCS and to use the national market for carbon in China to find the necessary resources?
Okay, thank you. As my understanding, CCS are the options, but at this moment in China, we pay more attention how to transform our economic, social, and energy. It's the first priorities. So CCS maybe is an option to resolve our our the carbon neutrality before 2060s. But at this moment, we should pay more attention on how to excellent our renewable and energy development and how to promote our traditional energy transitions. This is very important for us. Okay, thank you.
That's very encouraging answer. And I have to thank you about that because it is one of the most important sources of emission of carbon in the world. And obviously, nobody can imagine that you will close the coal thermic plants in China. That would be stupid. So, but retrofitting the coal thermic plants by CCS or CCUS, it's very costly.
Yes, you're right.
It's not something,
not only the cost, but also the scale is very small. Yeah.
It's very complicated.
Yes.
But it would be a major contribution. Beside all the contribution by China, which is huge. Probably China is a country, it is very often underestimated. China is the country which makes the most endeavors in renewables and in the fight, in the investment in the fight against global warming. So I don't underestimate, but you have your problems. Dora Benedek, a question: why is the IMF pledging for a global price of carbon, and would not make sense to allocate the receipt to emerging countries to help fund their investment in renewables?
Thank you. So, as we discussed, we know that urgent action is needed to address the challenges from climate change. And we at the IMF, we have been champions of carbon pricing. But we still don't really see the traction it would need to get across globally. So let me just briefly remind why we advocate for carbon pricing at the IMF. And let me give you 3 reasons. So the first one is that it uses market forces, which is always the most efficient. So it uses market forces to reach the efficient abatement opportunities. Having carbon pricing would both reduce the demand for emission-intensive production, but it would also encourage cleaner production processes at the same time. Second, it provides a critical signal to provide investment incentives towards cleaner technologies. And again, if we have a long-term predictable carbon pricing path for the future, that provides an even stronger signal for the private sector investors. And third, it produces revenues. So it's a really important aspect that carbon pricing produces revenues for the authorities at a really important time when they are facing fiscal constraints, but they need resources to decarbonize the economy. So getting these revenues from carbon pricing is really essential. Still, as I said, we don't see the traction that we would need, and so we need to understand why is that. So right now, between 45 to 50 countries have a carbon pricing or emission trading systems, and the list continues to grow. However, at the same time, the level of these measures doesn't even come close to the level that I mentioned in my previous response, which is the $75 per ton. So the average of the current carbon pricing schemes is closer to $6 per ton. So you can see how big is the difference. Some people argue that this is not the right time for introducing carbon pricing because the economies are faced with really high energy prices right now. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that introducing carbon pricing can be a longer-term process. So we can start with lower levels with a really credible longer-term plan on how we're going to reach higher levels. And this can be very much aligned with the expected reduction in the energy prices. But another concern that we hear, I think it's a really important one, that countries are really reluctant to move ahead unilaterally with introducing a carbon pricing because they are concerned of competitiveness issues. And I think for that reason, international cooperation on carbon pricing is really essential. So we at the IMF, we propose an international carbon price floor to be introduced. And we have a really pragmatic approach to this. So we think it's really important to get started with something, but we can first focus on a small number of countries where it's much easier to negotiate than, with the 200 countries around the world. So having a cooperation across, let's say, the 4 big economies, the US, China, India, and the European Union, would make it much easier to reach an agreement, but it would already cover about 2/3 of the expected emission by 2030, so it would already make a big difference. We also think we should be pragmatic and allow lower carbon prices in developing countries. So we don't need to have the same expectation to every country, but we can be really, we can have expectations depending on the level of development. And then we think carbon pricing being key to mitigation, but again, a pragmatic approach in terms of what we consider carbon pricing could be great. So we can include, packages like different taxes, emission trading systems, fee-based regulations. We need to understand the equivalence between these measures and carbon pricing, and then make sure that we really acknowledge all efforts that are being made. And finally, just to react on your question, I think it's important to note that private sector will be key to financing, the carbon transition. So it's important how public resources are distributed, but public resources will not be sufficient to finance all this change. So when we think about that, I think it's also important to keep in mind what else countries can do. They need to build a business-friendly environment. They need to build an environment that really attracts private sector investment. And that can be anything from institutions, rule of law, stability of the legal system. So all the usual suspects, and these go beyond carbon pricing, but a really important aspect to keep in mind when we think about the long-term prospects. Thank you.
Now, last but not least, a question to Anne van Dissendiet. About the perception of the mood in the industry concerning carbon emission. Do you think, Anne, that there is a momentum to mobilize the business community to phase out carbon in a large scale?
Thank you. I would say in brief, definitely yes. We are all know climate change is definitely the defining challenge of our time, and we must get on with it, and the industry is behind that. We see demand from customers now starting for low carbon steel. So by consequence, we see a strong momentum in the industry. And for example, from our side, we have worked for years now with our R&D capabilities on various technologies. As I said before, we need a combination of technologies. And we have defined our targets for 2050 and developed a concise roadmap to achieve those. So, as I said, regional roadmaps depend in particular on availability of energy resources, because that is really a very important point. We have started testing at scale some of the technologies. We have started some CCS technology pilots in France. We have started quite an important CCU investment in our plant in Ghent in Belgium. In Canada, we have just broken ground with the start of investments into a DRI plant. So we are doing a lot, and I think we are starting to replace the blast furnace then with the DRI plant. And other industries, the industry is generally speaking following that. And we think that as a global producer, we have a unique role to play. However, the energy crisis already, on the one hand, we have heard a lot about it, is putting a lot of constraint, of course, on the availability, basically, of finance. The good thing, as we heard it a lot, is that it pushes renewable energies, which we need a lot. But the problem really in particular is the different regional approaches to how to tackle this decarbonization. And we hear a lot about global carbon price. This is very good, as I said, but the regional differences will continue to be a problem, because it will attract investment in certain regions and not necessarily everywhere. So I really have to say we need to sort out the uncertainties in that regard. So the uncertainties also just generally about regulatory approaches. There are still uncertainties about what is basically sustainable hydrogen. For example, in the EU, there are still debates about definitions. There are still debates about how CCS will work in practice, how you get the carbon from one country into the other, how it is recognized, etc. And also uncertainties about what is basically actually low carbon steel. So everything is in the go, and my appeal is really the regulatory approaches need to align more and more, because otherwise it's going to be a hindrance. But definitely the steel industry is ready to go and is wanting to go.
Thank you very much. thank you. It's time to close this conversation. I must say that I am more optimistic at the end than when it started. This is a proof that you are convincing and you have a lot of energy. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. It was a pleasure. Thank you to the excellent panelists. It was a pleasure to have you during this conversation, this very interesting debate. And I have to thank the French pavilion, which allowed us to to take a little bit more time than expected. And so thank you very much for those who are in charge of the French pavilion. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Nina, who has been very important, to our sponsors. And if some of you are interested in methane, you are invited. There are few seats because it is in the premises of the International Chamber of Commerce. There are only 12 seats around the table, but we will manage if there are not too many people. Thank you again, and good luck.
Bonjour à tous. Hello. We are starting the impact finance session. Bonjour à tous et nous allons commencer notre session sur le financement de l'impact. Hello everyone and welcome to this session to impact finance. Perhaps a few words of introduction before leaving the floor to the panel. I'm Thierry Deo from Finance for Tomorrow, but I wanted to share a few comments on the journey that we've started a few years ago with impact finance in Finance for Tomorrow with all the institutions in Paris. This has been a 2-year journey really supported by the Ministry of Finance in France to really and that has involved over the years more than 200 people and institutions working in many working groups to actually focus on some really key achievements that will be discussed here today. Obviously, one was to try to converge in terms of definition of impact and how finance can actually use that definition to mobilize, move billions and trillions towards impact. And we also realized that impact finance is, in a way to really transform our economy and really support the transition, the climate transition as well of our economy. The other achievement, obviously, was because what you don't measure, you don't really achieve. Was finding the tools and the rules in terms of measurement of impact, and Xavier and all of the other members of the panel will be able to talk more in details about what was achieved. So with no further ado, I'll invite the panel to join the floor. We have Saria Kutsi from Crédit Agricole CIB, Hélène Lanier from 2 Degree Investing Initiative joining this panel, Xavier Ploquin from Meridiam and also Finance for Tomorrow. And this panel will be moderated by Raphaël Lebel from the Observatoire de la Finance Durable. So thank you and have a great panel.
Thank you so much, Thierry, for your introduction. And thank you again, everybody, for being here on the French pavilion of the COP27. Well, we'll start this first event by discussing how impact finance could help to finance the transition of the real economy. How much are we talking about? According to the OECD, there is about $444 billion under an impact investing approach today. 444 billion. I would say only. If we make a comparison, in France, we have the ESR label, RSI label, which is a label which covers ESG funds, which cover 900 billion, so the double. So we really need to hurry financing the transition and financing the real economy. And that's why I'm really happy to welcome an amazing speaker today that will present tools and enable financial actors to contribute to the transition of the real economy and help accompany the corporate, but also the sovereign, on the climate transition journey to net zero. So I introduce you Saria, who is based in Dubai and leads the development of sustainable banking in the Middle East of Crédit Agricole Corporate and Investment Bank. The Sustainable Bank team supports governments, financial institutions, and corporate clients in their needs for sustainable finance as they transition toward net zero. welcome, Sarah. Hélène Lanier is the managing director of 2 Degree Investing Initiative, which is an NGO think tank, we don't really know sometimes, which help to finance the transition, foster their positive impact in the planet. Hélène, you have more than 15 years experience in the financial sectors, both in private consultancy, as well as public regulation and supervisory institution. I'm very happy to welcome you today as well. And we have Xavier Plotin. Xavier, you are Chief of Staff and Principal at Meridiam, former advisor at the French Ministry of Ecological Transition. And thank you again to the Ministry to welcome us. You also worked at the Total Gas and Power New Energy USA and L'Oréal. Well, I'm very happy to welcome such an expert on sustainable finance and energy. And the one who coordinates the Impact Task Force as Finance for Tomorrow. Yes, you did. So first, I would like to, with a basic question, what is impact finance? Yes, we were talking about a lot about it, but we have different definitions sometimes. So what is impact finance? How you define the concept of impact finance? And why do we need to develop and style up impact finance, especially when we are talking about climate resilience? So Xavier, please.
Thank you, Raphael. Thank you for your introduction and for the numbers that you gave. And indeed, as you said, impact finance is supposed to represent 400 billion euros. But the number itself is quite suspectful because we don't really know what is impact finance. So this was the first and main goal of the Impact Task Force in Paris. It was to give a proper definition to what is impact finance. Because it can go from one part of the ladder to people doing very meticulous near philanthropy things to people claiming that they are impactful but that are basically doing just regular ISR investment. So we wanted to gather all of the Paris financial place and financial sector to give ourselves a clear definition and, if possible, a definition that could fit both the banks, the asset manager and the asset owners. Because the idea was that impact finance cannot be something that's different from the perspective from where you're looking for. So we gave ourselves a definition. We had focused big working groups. As Thierry mentioned, we were more than 200 in some of the plenaries. So since we were many people around the table, it resulted in a definition that's quite long, but I think that's quite easy to understand. The global idea of impact finance is that impact finance is the finance that tries to change the world or to have a concrete extra financial impact at the same time and together with financial return. So it relies on three main pillars, which are intentionality, additionality and measurement. And I will explain it in a few seconds. The idea of intentionality is that you have to claim that you are doing impact and you have to say first that you are going to do something. So you cannot say that things have changed because of you, but do not prove that it was you. Second, additionality, you have to prove that it was because of your investment, then you can claim this impact. Meaning that you have to have a methodology and to have concrete proof and examples that you have, that your investment resulted in the changes that you claim. And third, you have to make a proper measurement with a methodology that's clear, scientifically based and transparent so that it can be audited and it can be reported. So that the people that in maybe next COP or in one or maybe 2 or 3 COPs from here can say that the real precise number of impact investment is so much billions, because then we will have a concrete definition for that. So I think we have worked a lot on this definition. It is, I think, consensual now on Paris Financial Place, and I will describe in the second part of the session how we plan on implementing it at the Paris Financial Center scale.
Thank you very much for this definition. I would like to take the opportunity to thank Finance for Tomorrow, first of all, to have been associated us in the high-level discussions. It is very good that NGOs are also part of these discussions, and we were very happy to be contributing to this very good work and the good achievement. I would like to come back to some points Xavier just raised. We are very much aligned with the definition, and we believe this is a great achievement you made. For us in 2 Degrees Investment Initiative, impact means really making a difference. This is having a causing relationship between the actions of the financial institutions and the reduction in the real world. This is different from a mere portfolio alignment logical. This is much more related to engagement, commitment of the financial institutions to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And a very important point for us is also that it is demonstrable. This needs to be causal. There is a chain link between the financial institutions' actions and the reduction in the real world. So to really figure out what impact could be, you should take, first of all, what would be the situation if you had not invested first and foremost. So you have to compare the actual situation after investment with a counterfactual baseline scenario. And the difference between these 2 situations will give you a view, a picture of the impact. And this is really important to have this in mind, also to help decision makers and financial institutions engage in this pathway. And why is it so important that we discuss impact finance today? I would like to come back to that also. It is because we have conducted several surveys and several discussions with retail investors, and we have concluded that retail investors as well as institutional investors wait for impactful products. They want to have impact in the real world with their money. So it is key now that to achieve our climatic and environmental goals, that financial institutions really engage in climate strategies which are intended and designed to have impact.
Thank you very much for having me here. And I think you've already very clearly defined impact investments and impact finance. And I think from our point of view, what we want to underscore really is the need for scaling up quickly. That was the latter part of your question. For us, impact has to be material and it has to be measurable in a concrete way that can be benchmarked across peers. But really, I think what we need to focus on is the need to scale up finance quickly. So this week, the International Energy Agency published their World Energy Outlook. Their scenario for net zero emissions by 2050 requires $4 trillion in investment in clean energy annually. Today, we're only at 1.3 trillion. So we really need to ramp up impact investment. And what we need to see is governments taking the lead and giving us a strategic direction. But we also need to incentivize the private sector to play its part. So I think it's quite straightforward to provide financing for climate solutions such as solar, renewable energies. These are pure player companies, and it's easy to understand and determine the impact that they can have. But I think it's also necessary to focus on the technologies that are going to solve industrial decarbonization. And this part's a little bit harder. Much of the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that we're going to see by 2030 is driven by the existing technologies. But after 2030, it's going to be breakthrough technologies that are going to really be the game changer. And that's where we need to see financing scaled up just to be able to make these new technologies viable on a commercial scale.
Hear me? Yes. Thank you. My question is for you. That it's important to have the measurement of the impact. So how do you do to measure the impact? Which tool are you using to measure the impact on the real world?
For us, we have to rely on data. It's the hard data. I think for it to be really transparent, you need to have it audited and verified data that's produced by the company. The measure has to consider carbon reduction, We need to look at companies having really material measurements on what they're focusing on. It has to be about carbon reduction and not something that's slightly more secondary, I think.
You want me to answer? No, I think you are completely right. It's very important to have very good data, and maybe the next step or the final step of the working group task force will be to gather everyone and try to create a common agreement on some tools. Thanks. Some tools or some reporting frameworks, but for the moment, to be honest, at the task force level, it's something that seems beyond reach because we are already only agreeing on what we do, and I think it's very important that market actors like Crédit Agricole develop their tools that fit into the global vision, being that you have to be material, you have to be demonstrable, and then the tools will coordinate over the long term, and I think there will be kind of a market standard that will develop. The important is that the market standard is coherent with the vision that we have today.
And Hélène, at 2DI, I know that you are developing tools, so maybe you can talk a little bit about it?
Sure, thank you. It is true. It is sometimes a little bit difficult for decision makers and for financial institutions to operationalize what a climate strategy or what a impact strategy would be, because it is far from their daily activities, and it is sometimes also difficult to understand what it encompasses, because as we saw, this is a difficult step and this is a difficult pathways for financial institutions. Therefore, we developed in-house a framework which we have called the Climate Impact Management System. This was developed with the support of ICI, which is the International Climate Initiative from the German government, German Ministry for Environment and Nuclear Safety. So the CIMS, the Climate Impact Management System, is a framework designed for financial institutions to engage in operationalizing the climate strategy. It builds upon several standards such as ISO standards or the Impact Management Platform standards. And this is especially helpful for financial institutions wanting to engage in long-term commitments, but having the necessity to already engage in short-term strategic discussions. Therefore, we developed this framework as a several-stage process, a four-stage process, which begins with having the full picture of where we are. As a financial institution, you have to know how aligned you are and how aligned you would like to be in the future. This is really important to understand what the situation of your portfolio is and what is the progress you want to make. If you want to go far, you have to be really coherent and consistent in the way you are designing the plan. Otherwise, this will make no sense. And this is also key to have this big picture, to engage with the decision makers, with the whole management of the financial institutions. Otherwise, this would not work. The second stage, after having designed a consistent and coherent plan, is of course to implement it. So the Climate Impact Management System helps financial institutions implementing the action plan, be it at a business line level or at a product level. Third stage would be to disclose and communicate accurately on the progress you have made. We have very engaged in combating greenwashing, and therefore we want that financial institutions align their commitments and their transition plans with the communication and disclosure, be them voluntary or compulsory. And last but not least, the importance is also to continuously review and monitor progress a long time. So the SIMS helps you reassessing portfolio alignment along the line and all along the process to monitor process and be aware of where you are and whether you are on target or not.
Okay, thank you. And maybe a few words from like the Sustainable Finance Observatory. You are talking about portfolio alignment at the entity level. And just one point of view we have at the Sustainable Finance Observatory is that it's very important to do it at the entity level, but we need to do it as well at the global level as well, at the country level, at the global planet level, to make sure that all this alignment, all this change of comportment of each company make a real change in global to reach the 1.5 degree. Okay, so we are talking about having an impact on the real economy, especially when we are talking about climate resilience, right? But that means that we need to help to accompany the corporates behind in their change of business model. They need to change of business model. We all agree on that today. And so we need to finance the transition of the real economy. Can you share concrete example, all of you, of the way to accompany the actors, especially on emerging markets, especially in this COP, which is in Africa? Hélène, maybe to start again?
Okay, thank you very much. This is true. We have to accompany the actors in the pathways because it is difficult. And just to be very basic, what we observe when accompanying the partners we have is that they are far away from really having the global pictures of what tools are at disposal at the moment to engage in impactful and climate strategies. So everything we are doing begins always with building capacities with our partners. We have accompanied public partners such as regulators, supervisors, and private institutions, and all need really high-level and comprehensive capacity building trainings to be on track and to really understand what they can do. And maybe one project I would like to mention as a good example of what we did in emerging markets would be the project we had with IKI, again, our German partner funder, and RMI, which is the ex-Rocky Mountain Institute. We built the first ever Paris-aligned fund concept in Latin America together with Sura Investment Manager, which is the leading Colombian asset manager. Together, we developed a Paris-aligned investment fund concept. And the baseline was basically to create a fund that would seek to contribute to the decarbonization of key industrial sectors. And this would be meant by, we use two levers in this regard. First of all, we encourage Sura Investment Management to invest in aligned companies. But this would have been very simple to stay at this stage, and therefore we also engage them in the pathways of engaging with high-emitting industry to commit them to have a consistent and Paris-aligned decarbonization pathways. This took also into consideration some biodiversity and environmental goals all along the project. And as a conclusion, we have the feeling that building such a fund would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and have real-world impact all along the way.
Thank you so much, Hélène. And Xavier, maybe you can share some example on infrastructure from Meridian experiences.
Yeah, thanks. I think I can share examples of infrastructure and also SMEs, because I think it's interesting to underline the difference maybe in action that we have. In all of our funds, we use a temperature tool. We measure, as you mentioned, the temperature on a scope 3 basis, benchmarking it against the trajectory. It gives us the compass. It tells us where we are, because we are committed to being under 2 degrees. But when we look at infrastructure projects, we have developed a tool that's called Simple that helps us to drive the impact. We ask a lot of questions to the project themselves because we are majority shareholder most of the time or in control, so we can take the time to ask 200 questions to the project, and then we know exactly where they stand on each of the SDGs. We can set targets, and we have 25 years most of the time because we're very long fund, so we can commit to drive them to the initial score, which is poorer than it is later, and the very good score that we target in the end, and that we're committed with our LPs. We have the hands on the wheels in a way. For the SMEs, we try to apply the same system, but most of the time we are, growth investors, we're minority shareholders. So what we do is that we draft with the management an impact roadmap that we attach to the shareholder agreement or the status. And I think this is a very interesting dialogue because it's something that's concrete and that helps the managers realize what's the kind of impact that they can have in their company. And what I can say from an impact task force point of view is that it's really not common practice because we have co-investors most of the time, and one thing that's very important is that we call it from the beginning impact roadmap. And at some point when we set KPIs and say we are going to do this and we're be committed to reach this kind of impact, some of our co-investors say, well, if you say that, it may change the strategy of the company. And so, sure, we have to tell them, yes, that's the point of having an impact. And some of our co-investors that say, no, but we thought you would have like a checklist, like having a mandatory compliance thing or gender equality policy. And we say, that's not real impact. That's something that's like hygiene. That's something you have to do. And we say we really want to have a roadmap that's obviously something that can be done by the company still delivering a profit, but that has to be something they commit to and that deliver impact. And that's really not, that's not come to the brains of everyone actually, and not everyone has already agreed to use our definition of impact. So that's why I think, and that's one of the points I forgot to mention, we're creating a charter that we sincerely entice all of the French actors to sign and to apply to their fund. But basically the idea is that to stick to the definition that we have all drafted together, because I think it's really important that people start using impact finance for what it is, being something that really changes the way you manage your investment and you want to have an impact on the world.
Thank you so much. And Sarah, you are a bunch. Maybe you can give the mic. Yeah, you are a bunch, so you have this special role of financing the economy. We saw, like, with an asset manager, how they can engage with their company in portfolio. How do you manage to do the same to help them to change their business model? And if you maybe have some example in Africa continent, that would be very interesting.
Well, I think financing is not the start of where they start changing the business model. Financing comes at a much later stage. I think before a corporate can think about a sustainable financing strategy and issuing green bonds or sustainability-linked bonds, it actually needs to have a sustainability strategy in place. And I really like the way you picked up on that, and I think that's very true. Having a sustainability strategy isn't about having one line of a corporate vision to say, yes, we have a sustainability strategy. It's not just a page on your website. So really we work with our clients in the advisory capacity to support them in building and implementing ESG governance into their business models. And I think this really starts with an assessment of what are the ESG risks and opportunities that's relevant to the company, relevant to their sector. We would do a benchmarking exercise to see where they sit compared to their peers. And from there we create also an ESG roadmap. And that's just, it's the shorter phase. I think the harder work happens as the company then has to go through implementing ESG governance into its business model, and that can take months and years. It's quite a difficult process. I think the ESG strategy has to have it has to come from the top, and you have to have an identified ESG sponsor in the business who's pushing the momentum, pushing the drive. It has to come from within the company, not just from the bankers and the asset owners outside the company. It has to come from within. So we work with the management team to implement the governance into each business line. And I think, people like to measure progress. It's not just investors, it's companies themselves to say, well, okay, now that we're putting together our sustainability strategy, how do I know that it's working? How do I know that we're going somewhere? And that's where the data comes in, the KPIs, where you can give them hard data to say, look at where you've come today, where you were 5 years ago, and where you want to be in 5 years' time. And I think this is a section and a phase of the work that really takes a lot of time. It's months and years. It's not happening overnight. And only once you've implemented the governance can you even start thinking about financing it, because investors look very closely to find a very coherent strategy. What we don't want to have is opportunistic transactions, which happen quickly. That's where you start to see question marks raised around greenwashing, and we really need to avoid that for the corporates that we work with. So I think when companies start communicating on what are the steps that they've done, oftentimes you see clients rushing into that, and we need to slow them down and say, hang on, stop, do the work, then talk to us about it and talk to investors about it.
Yeah, incredible. I think we wanted to keep some time for question, and I don't know how we are on the timing, but it looks like we could take some question, I think. Cool. So, do we have some question from the audience? Okay, when we are waiting for a question from the audience, I will ask one myself. That's your privilege. We saw that there's this idea that to try the impact, but to be honest, at the end of the day, we need the company to run and to have profit. So how do you manage between I would say the KPI of result and benefits and the KPI of impact? Can you, is it like in addition of the KPI of result, or is it like two separate panels, indicators? How do you manage to put the impact on the global tracking system, I would say?
So, when you talk about KPIs, let's talk about sustainability-linked bonds as an example. I think the green bond market is very well established now. It's nearly 10 years old, and nearly $1 trillion has been issued. So we're at the stage now where I think the regulators see that there is a critical mass in the market and the need for regulation, and to give us a bit of guidance. I think the EU taxonomy did a very good job in defining exactly what is a green activity according to science-based criteria. So that's a good start there. But there's a lot of unanswered questions about the EU taxonomy. Who's there to apply it? How do we implement it? And where is it relevant? Just because a Middle Eastern or an African issuer isn't able to meet the very strict criteria of the EU taxonomy, does it mean that their activity is not green, even though it's helping them to transition? So I think we have to look at the region in which they're operating in to see what can be applied, and also bear in mind, in Europe, companies started to transition 10, 15 years ago, whereas in the Middle East and Africa, this transition has taken momentum in the last year, maybe 2 years. So different companies have different metrics. I think when we look at sustainability-linked bonds, this has really opened the door to a very new type of conversation that we have with clients. So, for example, many clients in the hard-to-abate sectors like aviation, like oil and gas, it's not easy for them to identify eligible green projects, and for them, it makes sense to raise financing for general corporate purposes, and that's where really the KPIs come in. And I think the KPIs that you set have to be very ambitious. They've got to really stretch the ambition of the company to make sure that they're incentivized to do better and to go the next step. The KPIs have to be core, and they absolutely have to include a carbon reduction metric and measure.
Of course. Do we have a question, or I go on? We have a question.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Just maybe for the figures at the beginning and to see maybe what is the expectation regarding the share of the market for impact finance and impact product, not based on current offer, but based on the demand maybe of retail side or investors. And yeah, this is the first question.
I have a mic in hand, so I will try and answer, which is not precise, but I will give you my vision, and I think the vision that we share at the Impact Group is that impact finance has to be mainstream. Because at some point, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in a few years, but in the end of the chain, there is someone that invests money and says, I want something back. And maybe people will say, I just want money. But what we think is that at some point in time, people will say, I want some money back, and I want to save that many cubic meters of water, and I want to create that many jobs. And that it won't be possible anymore to have a financial product that does not give information about this. And once you have that, you are nearly completely mainstreaming impact finance, because people will want to see the creation of this thing. So I think the target share, if you really ask the people what they want, is 100% or close to.
And the second question was a bit associated to the first one. It's the degree of impact, because with a sustainability-linked bond, for example, you can have impact with 10 bips of return. So, okay, it's impact, but it's small impact. And you also can have, for example, at ADEM, so I'm Mathieu Gardner from ADEM, and we make only impact at ADEM, but we give money to provide impact in the real world. So it's not private impact, but it's really strong impact. And so how to distinguish small impact, like in a sustainability-linked bond, and really a strong impact when you change really the world.
So I think this question is for you, Hélène, but I would just want to complete the answer from Xavier. I didn't think that we should reach the 100%. I think we need to keep like impact for the investment which have a real impact, and maybe accept to have maybe not the same profitability and some return on investment on this kind of project, which could be more risky or more. But on the meantime, maybe we can accept, ESG funds where you are just investing in projects which are already in place. For example, if you are investing in a farm solar which are already in place, you are part of this economy and you help this solar panel to keep in place. Maybe you give some money for the developer to make new projects. So this will not be impact, but it's still green investment. So I think it's, from my point of view, we should not cover 100%, but cover a part, so that will help to develop this one and accept other investments which are only green, but it's fine. But let's have an answer to the second question.
Yeah, I wanted to complete on some points, because we have been conducting some surveys with retail investors lately in different European countries, and what we observe is that when asking retail investors about their primary goals in investing, we have results between 15 and 20% asking primary to have impact, meaning to have a real causal effect on the real economy. And when screening the funds available at the moment in the different countries, we can only classify like 1% of the funds as being impact related. So we see there is a large gap between retail investors' expectations, and how products are distributed and proposed to the clients at the moment. So we believe the progress margin is very high, and there are progress to be made. And to complete also, we would also agree that several types of products be available to answer to the different expectations and availabilities to the retail investors. We do not have all the same expectations, and green products are okay if they claim to deliver what they can deliver. That is the whole point.
Do we have time for another one last question? Yes, look, cool.
Thank you. I'm actually part of the delegation from École Normale Supérieure. I'm the teacher accompanying the students. And so perhaps this is a bit tangential, but I'm interested to understand what the role of research could be, for example, in developing the tools that Hélène, you talked about. And also, how do we educate the students to take part in this process? Thank you.
So our research are basically open access, open source. So you can screen all of our work in the on our website to degreesinvesting.org. What we are doing is that we are conducting surveys and mystery shopping visits in financial institutions to have a whole picture of the landscape, especially in the European countries. And we also work hand in hand with financial institutions, financial regulators, supervisors, and central banks, especially in emerging markets, to also engage in bilateral and multilateral discussions and gather their expectations and their needs, because needs for developing countries and especially low-income countries are not the same as what we develop for European countries. So we adapt to each and every context.
Well, thank you so much. Syria or Xavier, do you want the final word?
I think I'll leave the research points to my colleagues here.
Now, maybe on the research point, in the group we work with ILB, Institut Louis Bachelier, and some other actors. Obviously, 2DI is very close to the research. And I think research is key, because one of the 3 pillars, which is additionality, means that you have to measure concretely what's been additional, and that's very tricky. Actually, it's probably something you cannot give a proper answer to, because when it comes to money and profit, it's quite easy. If you own something, you are allocated the money that it produces. For the impact, who did the impact? The company, the investor, the lender? It's very hard to share, because everyone can claim it. So I think research has to give an answer alongside probably conventional conventions. But it will be very important to educate people, because it's really at this stage uneasy to talk about impact to everyone, because everyone has its own definition and everyone has its own thinking about the impact itself. So training is the next big step, I think, is that the new generation of investors must have this in mind.
Yeah, and I think that's why we are so happy to speak about impact in this pavilion today at the COP27. This is the end of the first session, but there is another session coming just now, so just stay here, stay online. We are just swapping the seat, and we welcome soon the next panelist. Thank you again, and bye.
Thank you, Raphael.
Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to this second part of today's session in the French Pavilion. I'm Rosenstein. I'm Head of Climate and Biodiversity for AXA Group, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this session, 5 Ways Private Sector is Driving Climate Resilience. And I'd like to just start by welcoming and thanking kindly our panelists. We're really excited to bring together on Finance Day today at the COP representatives from both the public and private sector to talk about how we can collaborate to help drive resilience. So on my left, I have Rowan Douglas, who's Head of Climate and Resilience, the Climate and Resilience Hub, at Willis Tower Watson. Thank you, Rowan. And then I have Arnaud Uzabiaga, who's Head of Impact at Proparco in France. To my right, I have Karina Wally, who's the Head of Private Sector Development for AXA Climate. And she'll talk a little bit about what AXA Climate does. And finally, we have Sam Igube, who is the Commissioner for Economic Planning and Budget for Lagos-Stat. Thank you very much for being with us. So the purpose of today's session is to share with everyone 5 different ways that the private sector can help contribute to driving climate resilience. And at AXA, we are both an insurer and an investor, and we strive to use both sides of our balance sheet to contribute to this overall goal. And so to start today's session, we wanted to share with you a project that AXA's been involved in now for a number of years. When you walk up and down the halls here, you see blended finance everywhere. And it's I think, one of the really key and hot topics of this COP. And it is possible, and there are different tools available for large institutional investors and insurers like AXA to participate, particularly in financing adaptation. So before I start my first question for Arnaud, I just wanted to speak a few minutes about AXA's participation in the Managed Co-Lending Portfolio Program, also known as the MCPP, which is managed by the International Finance Corporation. The IFC started this project in 2013, and AXA came on board in 2018. And a critical component for an institutional investor like AXA to be able to participate in such a program is that it is an investment-grade portfolio, which really means that a large investor like us, we can have the confidence to invest our funds on behalf of our clients in such project. So we came on board in 2018, and the focus of what we are investing in is infrastructure loans. So we worked with the IFC for around 18 months to find a suitable setup, and we were able to also ensure that that we were able to include key guidelines and standards for us as an institutional investor. And we committed $500 million, from AXA entities. And today we have a number of projects that are up and running, which were made available with funds from AXA and other investors as well, such as the Tafila Wind project in the south of Jordan. So this is a project that was committed in 2013 and is up and in operation since 2015. So the projects that we're funding, they cover a whole range of infrastructure, including a lot of energy projects as well, with a nice geographical spread. We do say sometimes it's hard to replicate these projects, but I'm hoping perhaps Arnaud can help us talk a little bit more about the ways in which Proparco, perhaps say a word about Proparco's role, can help to get private finance involved. What types of blended finance instruments are you using at Proparco to help get private finance involved in funding adaptation and or mitigation projects?
Thanks, Roselyne. Hi, everyone. Arnaud from Proparco. We're the French Development Finance Institution. We're the private sector arm of the French Development Agency. So at Proparco, we have a long experience of blended finance. We use it a lot for all kinds of impact. We also have a strong experience of adaptation and ramping up on adaptation. But unfortunately, we don't have large-scale examples of blended finance projects that help scale up on adaptation finance. I think it's a powerful tool to crowd in investors. Obviously, we can help de-risk part of the transaction. It attracts investors from that are usually not likely to finance projects in emerging markets or more impactful projects. But I think if we stay focused on adaptation, the title of the UNEP adaptation gap report that was released last week is Too Little, Too Slow. And well, blended finance is limited in terms of scale, and it takes time. So it doesn't help for the too little, too slow. So I think our contribution can go way beyond just the financial de-risking for projects.
So what other tools then, apart from de-risking, what does Proparco offer to work with private finance partners for funding projects?
Thanks. It relates well with the first part of the talk, actually, because like for the rest of impact finance, we can contribute a lot on building common definitions, building common tools, and it's much needed on the adaptation front as well. So, well, defining impact finance was not easy. Finance for Tomorrow did a great job on this, and we're happy to contribute. I think there's a huge need as well to understand what is really impact on adaptation finance. Xavier mentioned what is just hygiene and what is additional impact, and I think it's key for adaptation projects. And we work a lot on this, and happy to share. I think another way that we can contribute is, if we want to scale up, I think the best way is to mainstream adaptation finance in our day-to-day operation. I think it's the case for all investors or most companies. If we look for pure adaptation project, we'll have limited scale in the end. But if we start integrating climate risk considerations very early on the process, it's easier to bring an adaptation component. And as well, I mean, adaptation is not always bankable. I'll talk a bit later, a bit more on this later. But if we plug it in a larger project or larger financing, maybe it's a good way to help scale up. And another way we can help, well, there's a huge need to develop metrics. I think Sarah mentioned that private investors need to rely on data. They need to rely on, they need to have reliable metrics. We work on building those sort of metrics. It's also, I think it's both financial and extra financial, because we hear a lot that the main issue with adaptation finance is that it's not bankable. But adaptation project, in fact, pay a triple dividend on the financial side. They help you reduce the risk of the counterpart you're financing, and if you're the beneficiary, they provide huge environmental and social benefits, and as well they help you reduce your loss and damage, which is a big topic for this COP.
It's definitely a very important subject that's being negotiated at the moment at this COP. Thank you very much, Arnaud. I'd now like to turn to Karina. I have a few questions. We did say we had 5 different ways that the private sector is driving climate resilience. So we're going to switch from talking about de-risking and other blended finance instruments now to talk about impact finance, and to talk about an example that AXA Climate recently announced of investing in regenerative agriculture. Could you tell us a little bit about this project?
Sure. So, thanks very much. So this is actually, well, I'll take a step back to give you the context. So essentially, it's Unilever, it's AXA, it's TKO Capital, and they share this common belief that the way that agriculture is done today is just not sustainable. So food is obviously produced in a way that is really degrading soil fertility. You've got pesticides and fertilizers that are damaging biodiversity, polluting water supplies, releasing large amounts of greenhouse gases, but also pushing up the production costs for farmers. So Unilever, AXA, and TKO Capital thought, can we create a partnership where you've got industrial players, you've got financial players coming together to really try to help the agriculture sector transition at scale. So the investment strategy is really, holistically shift the entire agriculture and food value chain in close collaboration with the stakeholders and from farm to fork, so across the entire value chain. So the goal is improve the health of soil, and in that way improve our own health. So you might be asking yourself, what is regenerative agriculture? Because I didn't have a clue when I first joined AXA. But it's essentially a nature-based solution. So it's land management practices that are leveraging the natural and the ecosystemic services of photosynthesis of plants to close the carbon cycle, to improve crop resilience, to improve nutrient diversity, and many other things. So to give you some tangible examples, it's reducing fertilizer, it's increasing crop cover, it's reducing the amount that you're tilling and moving the soil around, it's mixing different types of crops, it's mixing forestry with crops, agroforestry. So I think lots of people already know about this. There's lots of nodding. There's a lot of benefits from this because not only is it mitigating climate change, it's actually acting as a carbon sink. The soil, as the healthier it gets, the more carbon it actually sucks in or absorbs. But it's also rebuilding the degraded soil biodiversity, which increases the carbon drawdown even more, and then it's improving the water cycle and obviously reducing the amount of chemicals that we're using. So this fund is exactly trying to focus on these kind of practices. The target size is €1 billion. Each of the investment partners have put in 100 million each, and they're busy fundraising for the rest of the 700 million with the big institutional investors and public entities. So it's a private equity fund. It's an Article 9 impact fund. It's using equity or equity-like financing to really invest in companies or the underlying projects that are involved in these kind of practices. So the kind of subsectors that we've identified are sustainable agriculture businesses, food and ag tech, alternative consumption, and there might be more. So that alternative consumption is like vegetable-based food, like alternative vegetable-based foods. It's quite a long-term fund. It's 15 years, and each of the investments will probably be about 5 to 10 years, which is actually longer than usual. And this is just because to actually shift the agricultural practices takes a bit longer to materialize the benefits and needs large investments, which is why we've created it so long-term. We're going to target around 15 to 20 companies, about 30 to 100 million euros each. And we're going to try and diversify it across different sectors, across different geographies and different maturity stages. So to give you a bit of a context again as to why it was Unilever, AXA and TKO, essentially Unilever had already committed in 2020 to invest €1 billion in climate and nature. AXA had created AXA Climate, which is really dedicated to help large companies and public institutions to adapt to climate. TKO had structured its Climate Action Centre and has already raised €1.5 billion for that. So we brought the three complementary players together. So you've got Unilever with that really deep thematic expertise on the food value chain. We've got AXA. We've obviously got a lot of experience in agriculture risk management and impact monitoring. So we'll be doing the kind of impact monitoring for the fund. We've got TKO, who has this unique track record in setting up climate funds, alongside industrial players and really generating return from these projects. So I think it's a powerful example of how three complementary players have come together to improve a key sector, which is agriculture, at scale. And I really hope we can replicate it.
Thanks very much, Karina. I think what's really interesting is looking at how even in the private sector we can use partnerships, particularly between the finance actors and those in the real economy, and how we can bring our complementary skills and experience together, and in the case of the Impact Fund. And you also talked on another theme that I think we hear a lot about, using our supply chains also to help drive change. And I know that AXA Climate's also working with L'Oréal, but this time in its capacity as an insurer. Could you tell us a little bit about this partnership and what it aims to achieve in terms of climate resilience?
Sure. So L'Oréal came to us because they had a solidarity sourcing program And they've got a bit of a unique feature. I don't know if it's unique, but they have a feature where normally companies can easily switch their supply chains to another country if there's an issue. But L'Oreal is really using raw materials that are quite rare. They're usually in one geographic zone. So if they are, the farmers are hit by multiple shocks and stop farming, then that does actually present a supply chain risk to L'Oreal. So they were concerned not only about climate change, but about any kind of shocks that could impact the farmers. So we decided to focus on the shea farmer butters and shea butter farmers in Burkina Faso, which grouped together the largest of the farmers within the supply chain for these kind of raw materials in Burkina Faso. There were 40,000 women collectors. And we found that the actual climate impact on shea butter itself wasn't that big, but all these women were doing subsistence farming for maize to feed themselves, which was very climate sensitive. And they were also completely uninsured for any health and life cover. So we got different teams within AXA to put together an insurance product to cover the actual drought impact of maize. Using parametric insurance, which is essentially based on rainfall satellite data that can trigger payout just after the season, as well as a health and life cover. And that was really structured in a way to be micro-insurance-like, so really adapted to what the needs of the farmers were. So, paying out to cover a trip to the hospital and covering the stay while they're at hospital and things that the farmers would really actually need. So we had a payout this year. There was a big drought in Burkina Faso. The woman got 130,000 euros within a few days of the drought hitting. There were also a number of health claims. So the proof of concept was really proven. And I think we can really use this kind of example to be replicated across different large corporates. We're talking, Nespresso has been looking into this for the past year with discussion with IKEA. So I think if we can see how to...
Consortium of insurers, including AXA Climate, through the Insurance Development Forum to set up parametric flood insurance for disaster relief. Can you tell us why Lagos State is insuring itself against flood risk and how this will benefit your state? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Lagos State is a frontline state, it's a coastal state. A third of its mass is really water bodies and it's exposed, coastally. And that presents a lot of risk, right? We therefore need to manage that risk for impact. But we also need to manage our ability to adapt also at the same time. So on one hand, we need to be able to adapt to reduce the implication of the occurrence of floods and climate change. But on the other hand, we need to also manage the impact when it occurs. It's in managing the impact when it occurs that you see us then introduce different risk mitigating instruments or structures. And one of them is insurance. What insurance basically does is it reduces how quickly we can recover when those risks does crystallize. And Lagos, for example, from our climate adaptation resilience plan, indicates that over 2 million people are going to be exposed, right, and vulnerable, right, when these things do occur. Is going to lead to loss of income, is going to lead to reduced economic activities and disruptions, and therefore we need to be able to stream people back quickly. Is the reason why we are partnering on our parametric insurance programs, basically for that to happen. But other things we are trying to do, right, that basically helps to risk assure us, right, is basically to introduce risk insurance in a blended way, right, that encourages investors to invest in our climate adaptation programs. We also, as a state, are working on a law, right, that will trigger off the Lagos State Wealth Fund. That fund basically has stabilization funds under it and a future securities fund that also enables us as a state to act when such things occur. On the health side, we have a health insurance as well. I see nothing that devastates vulnerable people and when this risk occur. And therefore, on the health side, we have a health insurance program that tends to attempt to adopt, because we have developed a register of the vulnerable, about 500 to 2 million people, right, that are in that register, that we tend to look for insurance, really, in a subsidized way to take them on. And we also open up those opportunities to investors to adopt vulnerable population in case the risk does really occur. In addition to that, we have subjected ourselves to international rating agencies. Today, Lagos State is rated AAA by Fitch. What that does is that it tells investors that the risk with dealing with Lagos State is super good, right? And they can invest. So in managing all of these risks element, insurance is one part of it that tends to block it. But that also brings us in close proximity with insurance entities, right, who also invest, right? And I mean, we believe that, I mean, for example, in relocating the vulnerable, we'll need about $20 million to do that, right, as part of our adaptation plan. And all of this then opens up. And I don't know if I will have time to talk again about the climate adaptation plan as to how it works, but maybe I should just stop here to address your questions directly.
Thanks very much, Sam. And I think you raised a really important point about the linkages between health and climate change, which we also saw in the partnership with L'Oréal. And particularly in adaptation context, it's very important to be able to have a holistic view of how to address that risk for communities. So I think we have a little bit of time, so I did want to ask a follow-up question, which is, you did mention the Climate Adaptation Investment Program, but could you tell us more about this, perhaps some concrete examples in addition to what you've mentioned?
Okay, so what scares investors, and I hear it all the time, they don't have data, the risks are high, they are afraid, right? And so the Lagos State Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program is an evidence-based approach to evaluating the risks, right? And that way you are able to come up with data as to the cost of inaction, where the risks are, and to try and establish a basis for investment. So for example, the cost of inaction for Lagos will be $30 billion, right? And we have therefore, out of that program and the plan, we've been able to evaluate and develop projects, specific projects, about 38 of them, that allow us adapt and build a more resilient city. That plan is broken down into issues around protecting the vulnerable, issues around building resilient infrastructure that can adapt properly, and then building very resilient community. It also tries to then separate differences between the nature of intervention and funding that is required, right? Whether they are in grants, whether they are low interest bearing support, or whether they are just pure commercial viable loans. So it analyzes it in that form. And we are able to then say that we need about $8 billion to strengthen the resilience posture of Lagos to adapt to the risk. So you can then see $8 billion compared to, if the risk crystallizes, $30 billion, and it then shows you something like a social impact return on investment, right? So that's what basically it is, and we have 38 of such projects that have been worked on with experts that are open for investors, and it's our hope that we are able to meet investors, maybe 5 or more, that can work with us to implement the adaptation plan on a blended basis, and so on and so forth, knowing also that we have other things that help mitigate further the risks that are associated with this.
Thank you very much. there's so much in that plan, and it's incredibly impressive work that you're doing. We now will turn to our fifth and final example of how the private sector is driving climate resilience, and this is another example from insurance. It's the MAR Fund. And so, Rowan, we can use insurance to ensure that we can protect ecosystems that are also not only vulnerable to climate change, but also play an important role in protecting as well against climate change. So Willis Tower Watson has been working with AXA Climate, among others. And could you tell us a little about the MAR Fund? Where is it? What is what is it ensuring? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosalind, and great to be here. And in fact, I'm really going to pick up on many of the themes that Karina and Sam have been talking about around speed and transparency and having impact on exposed communities. So actually following some Pathfinder work done by the Nature Conservancy and Swiss Re in an earlier program, we began to work with the MAR Fund, which is a group of, it's a trust bringing together 4 countries in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, and Mexico, who each have a shared interest in what I think the second largest coral reef system in the world after the Great Barrier Reef. And there's a recognition that the communities and activities that depend on this reef need to find an organized financial way of protecting and managing that reef. So what does that mean? Well, last week, some of you may remember, a hurricane, Hurricane Lisa, tracked through the Caribbean Sea and crossed the Mesoamerican Reef near Belize as a Category 1 hurricane. Normally, that would have happened and people would have said, oh dear, what a shame, the coral reef has been damaged again, what can we do about it? But this time, it was different because as the satellites that Karina mentioned were tracking that hurricane coming across, pre-arranged teams around the Mesoamerican Reef were being prepared to go onto the reef immediately it was safe after the hurricane to begin to repair and restore that reef. Because believe it or not, reefs can be repaired and restored in ways that then enable the reef to recover much, much more quickly. So knowing, because a program had been put together by the MAR Fund with the help of Willis Towers Watson, underwritten by AXA and Munich Re, they knew that immediately after that hurricane was tracked, a significant payout would occur, nearly $200,000, which is funding that reef repair work. It's so exciting because those communities that depend on the reef will know that they have a reef to depend on much more quickly. But it's more than just a payout, because actually to create a structure like this requires all the communities involved to understand the risk to the reef. What are the chances of the hurricane? How much funding is required? When an event occurs, who needs to be mobilized? So it's very, very exciting to see insurance as a form of governance and coordination, much more than just a product. So I think we've got a videotape that we can run, which is far more exciting than listening to me, of the teams out there getting ready to undertake this sort of work. We just want to say before we leave, it was this program was supported with the help of many people, including AURA, the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, who have some shows next door in the Resilience Hub, the Government of Canada. But this is really the beginning, I think, of a program to protect ecosystems around the world. You don't need to own a product, own an asset to have an insurable interest in it. That's very important for ecosystems, which are often not owned by anyone, they are common. And you don't have to have an income stream to show value. If it's protecting your risk, that's value in itself. So we're starting in these areas, but I have a hope that within, by 2030, all of the world's coral reefs in both the developed and developing economies will have some form of protection to actually allow us to then manage the risk within tolerable parameters. But I don't know how to say this in French, so I'll say it in English. Run, VT. Can we do that?
I don't know how to say that in French.
Let's give it a shot.
It's time for the video, if we can have that.
Oh, we've got the good French subtitles. While we're waiting for the VT to run, I should just acknowledge at the...
I work as a research associate at the Bay Islands Conservation Association, which is located in Roatan, Honduras. Roatan is part of the second largest coral reef in the world, the Mesoamerican Reef. Extends over 625 miles and we share between 4 different countries, which is Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. Over 2 million people depend on the natural sources that the Mesoamerican Reef provide. Recent studies indicate that the annual economic value of the different environmental services of the Mar amounts to $183 million for fishing, $3.9 billion for tourism, and around $400 million in cost of protection. The coral reef are very delicate ecosystem in dealing with climate change, overfishing, pollution, disease, and sustainable tourism are some of the biggest threats that the corals currently face. We all lose when a hurricane enters our territory, both nationally and personally. The locals close their businesses, the dive centers cannot carry out their activities, the communities cannot go out to fish, tourists do not come to our beaches. Corals only grow 0.3 to 8 centimeters a year, so imagine how many years will it take for this ecosystem to recover if they are destroyed today. It is critical to take action in the next 45 days after a hurricane so that the corals do not die. There is a new initiative with Hope for the Reef, a group of divers and snorkelers with specialized training to assess and provide aid to the reef, the brigades. The brigades are committee people from all different backgrounds with one objective, to restore and rehabilitate the reef after an event. The brigades need to act fast. As I mentioned, damage to coral reef must be addressed within 45 days. The marine insurance program designed by WTW and enabled by Marfan allows brigadiers like us in the Bay Islands National Marine Park to go out and do this important work because the insurance payouts provides quick access to finance that will support our reef restoration activities. With all local support is focused on subsiding after an event like a hurricane, the payouts from the insurance coverage are the only source of immediate financial support for reef conservation and recovery. When reef structure is damaged, our communities are left unprotected. By rehabilitating the reef, we bring back that essential work that the reef provides to our communities, the natural cost of protection. Coral reefs are among the most biologically diverse and valuable ecosystems on Earth, and they need our help. By supporting initiatives like the parametric insurance, we're ensuring a future with corals.
Just before I hand back Rosalind, to just acknowledge the leader of this work is very innocently sitting at the back, Dr. Simon Young, together with Sarah Conway, who leads our ecosystems work, who very appropriately lives and works from France, which I think is very appropriate as we're here in the French Pavilion. So, no, really exciting, and it's been great to work with the AXA team in this and other areas. It's a truly progressive team, and very exciting about the work we're doing with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron, for being with us. So we've got a few minutes. I think if there are any questions from the audience, we hope what we've been able to share with you today is how AXA is using its activities as both an investor and an insurer to help drive resilience in many different contexts. We've taken a bit of a trip around the world today, but we just wanted to share what's possible, and in each case you will have seen that partnerships have been absolutely essential, whether it's with our peers from the finance sector, whether it's with real economy actors, whether it's with development institutions and finance institutions such as Proparco, or with also governments as well. So I can see we have one hand in the audience. Is there a microphone?
Thank you. Well, thanks a lot for the session. That was really, really interesting. I have a question for Rowan, but kind of broader. So with the reef, I understand that there is like very technical work to repair and restore. But what about some work on the coast, in the mangrove areas to also protect like the coastal lands and to also involve the communities? How the private sector could actually do that?
Absolutely. I mean, the coral reef is yes. You got to know how to use an aqualung to repair the coral reef. But no, the principle is these sorts of programs can be created to protect any terrestrial or marine ecosystem. And what really matters is usually blending both funding to support ongoing resilience measures to manage ecosystems every day, every week, every month. For the general health of the ecosystem, but also to ensure that when extreme events occur, that there is additional support and funding for that ramp up required. And those sorts of teams and assets have to be pre-trained. They have to be pre-arranged. You can't usually assimilate them within a few days, particularly if a major event has occurred. So, no, please assume that this principle can be applied, but critically it's about blending ongoing risk management, which is ultimately allowing communities to have the confidence to prosper and thrive, but with also the acknowledgement that extreme events will happen and not treat them as some unexpected vicissitude, and integrate that within the planning. So, no, very exciting, and in some ways coral reefs are probably some of the harder areas to deal with because of their challenging geography. But no, we really want to see how we can expand this concept really to many ecosystem assets around the world and use this principle of insurance as a very powerful lever, which really unlocks many other forms of finance. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I don't know if are there any other questions? Yes.
It's a question for Karina, actually. I was interested on the regenerative agriculture fund, and I just wonder where, a similar question actually to sort of Rowan, but where can that go in terms of, because it's actually providing investment and insurance to fund the transition to a net zero world. So, yeah, where do you see it going next?
Well, and I think the first point is that there's not just agriculture that we can focus on. So I think Chip's in the audience here, they've got a lot of initiatives that are looking at the ocean and how to, take the same concept where you're bringing together different complementary partners to co-invest in kind of ocean regenerative practices. So you've got different sectors that you can start applying the same model to. And then I think within the actual regenerative agriculture side, there's so much that needs to be done on the entire value chain that I think $1 billion isn't enough. So I think we could definitely times that by 10 and get the public investors involved and do some wide-scale things. I think it's just a drop in the ocean, to be honest, to what can be done if you looking at different sectors and then increasing the scale significantly. In terms of the insurance side, what we're trying to do, which I didn't mention, and it's not really to do with the Regenerative Agriculture Fund in itself, but we're trying to see, because yield will go down at the beginning when you start to transition. You stop using fertilizers, etc. Your yield will drop, and then it'll eventually come back and hopefully increase over time, is the theory. But we're trying to see, can we help to finance that initial reduction in yield, that drop in revenue, as well as ensuring that peak back up, to say if it doesn't get back up to peak, or if there's more volatility, we can help you to smooth that those practices. So you will be perhaps a bit more risky in the beginning, but that insurance will help, as well as the financing will help you to transition. So I think that's another aspect that you can integrate into these investments to make it go a bit further.
Thanks very much, Karina. I think that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope it's been interesting for everyone, and have a great rest of day. Thank you.
Alors, Jean-Luc, je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez.
Oui, tout à fait.
Oui,
J'ai retiré
super.
le mute.
Alors, juste, je viens de parler avec Kane qui m'a dit que vous n'aviez pas de micro. Et
J'ai pas de micro, j'ai juste le micro. Je préfère passer par l'iPhone que par l'ordinateur parce que on a un niveau cyber très élevé. Et je savais pas ce que vous alliez me proposer, mais le Zoom, je sais que de temps en temps, il est allergique, c'est-à-dire qu'il nous laisse 5 minutes et après, il nous déconnecte. Donc j'ai peur de me connecter avec l'ordinateur.
D'accord. Vous n'avez pas d'écouteurs avec un micro intégré?
Ah oui, ça, je peux mettre un écouteur si vous voulez faire le test. Par rapport au téléphone, oui, un instant. Attendez, où est-ce que je le mets? Si c'est mieux, peut-être. Ouais, c'est vrai, c'est peut-être mieux. Allez, on va faire l'essai. Oui. D'accord. Est-ce que vous m'entendez mieux là? J'ai mis un écouteur micro. Ah, d'accord. Ouais. D'accord. Bah là, j'ai mis l'écouteur. J'ai mis l'écouteur. Avant, je les avais pas. Ok. Ok. Je me remute. Ouais, à tout à l'heure. Not sure it's better. I don't know how to do it. You need to teach me. Okay. That's the only thing I can do because I have never put any on the smartphone. I never put another kind of screen. Comme ça? Ouais, tout à fait. Mais là, vous savez, je ne sais pas où est-ce qu'il faut aller pour le faire dans un temps restreint, en fait. Non, mais vous pouvez le dire en anglais, il n'y a pas de problème. Mais il faut juste que vous me guidiez où est-ce que je dois aller dans Réglages, parce que sinon, je m'amuse pas trop à faire ça. Donc. Oui. Oui. Le 4 mois, attendez, je vois pas. Pour l'instant, j'ai rien de ça. Parce que c'est très lent. J'ai pas tous les trucs qui se. Oui, j'ai compris, mais. Oui, je vois bien, mais. Ouais, là, il faut me faire un cours avant. Parce qu'en fait, moi, je m'amuse pas trop à ce genre de trucs, donc. Ouais. Ouais, je comprends. Ok. Ok. Vous me dites quand... Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui va nous introduire ou il faut qu'on le fasse nous-mêmes? D'accord, ok. Ok, d'accord. Et quand il faut y aller, d'accord. Ok, ça marche. Ok. Ça marche. Merci. Oups.
Hello. Hello everyone. So I have the pleasure to introduce the new event. We have here three big groups. Je sais plus les noms. And Jean-Luc Paoli. Jean-Luc Di Paola from Valeo are the first group to introduce. After
Good afternoon.
We will have Sandrine Boutier-Streff from Sanofi and myself, Isabelle Monouri from Suez. Jean-Luc, I let you the floor.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. And sorry not to be there with you, but it's a pleasure to start. So, first of all, maybe not all of you know what Valeo is. Valeo is a global technology automotive supplier, and we are worth more than 17 billion euro turnover worldwide with more than 100,000 employees, including nearly 3,000 people in Egypt here in software near Cairo, where I am, with 180 production sites and 64 R&D centers around 31 countries. And we are one of the leaders that are bringing electrification to reality in road mobility, in all type of vehicles, mainly private vehicles, but also two-wheelers, three-wheelers, trucks, and buses. We're specified in ADAS, in security and safety, with sensors, radars, and lidars, in electrification with electric powertrain, but also with thermal systems. And we also are very present in lighting and also wiping devices. If you can put the slide, the first slide, so that people get a summary of what I've just said. Yes, next slide. Yes, that's it. And next slide again. I would say our credo, it's to make electrification affordable. This is what we have decided, the three group of us, to share. And you see on screen indeed a rickshaw, because to make electrification affordable, I wanted to pick the example of one of the largest countries in the world, which is India, with, as you know, more than 1,400,000,000 inhabitants. And if you go to the next slide, you will see a video that explains to you.
India is a unique market where multiple low-cost transportation options are used to meet the increasing first and last mile connectivity requirements, with 2- and 3-wheelers as the preferred option. In the last few years, the electrification of these vehicles has grown substantially. Valeo, a pioneer and world leader in electrical powertrain systems, is introducing a fully integrated, compact electric powertrain system for 2- and 3-wheelers in India. Built on advanced 48-volt powertrain technology at an affordable cost. Valeo's expertise in automotive powertrains contributes to reducing CO2 emissions. It is an ideal solution for the electric mobility revolution in India. Valeo's electric powertrain is a versatile solution that is customizable to suit different vehicle segments. This technologically superior solution is cost-effective. OEMs can leverage the local expertise of Valeo's engineering experts to expedite the integration process, which will enable them to go to market within a short period. Valeo's electric powertrain is reliable and safe. Valeo's electric powertrain system, a game-changing technology.
Thank you. If you go to the next slide, so you have seen that electric motors can also be beyond vehicles, sedans, or small segments in developed countries, but also in large emerging markets such as India, which is a benchmark for electrifying many other emerging countries that are present also here at COP27. And we got a PACE award, which is, if you want, a sort of Nobel Prize of automotive for such kind of device as you see it on the screen. Next slide. Next again. And here it's very important, because why I decided to choose that example. When you see the forecast for electrification on the Indian automotive market, you see a rapid progression on 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers compared to general private vehicles. So indeed, if we want to electrify India, Valeo, as a B2B and technology provider, is willing to take the chunk of electrification that, as you see in the forecast of the market, is going to reach just by 2026, which means in just 4 years from now, for the one scenario in slow penetration, which is, I would say, the less positive scenario, between 20 up to 35% of the market, 20% for the 2-wheeler, 35% for the 3-wheelers. If we take a fast penetration, which is a more optimistic market, we reach off 50% for both kind of vehicles. And you see that they are much above the private vehicles in general. So indeed, if we want to electrify emerging countries' mobility, accessing that market through 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers, it is a winning solution for a supplier like us, but it is a winning solution indeed, and very affordable and cheap for emerging countries such as India. This is why I wanted to introduce the topic like that, and I stopped to give enough time and introduce also the press introduction to my colleagues. So I hand over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. So I'm Sandrine Boutier-Streff. I'm the Global Head of Corporate Social Responsibility at Sanofi. Sanofi is one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. having 95,000 people spread in more than 300 countries, and so we have around 80 industrial plants or R&D plants or tertiary offices. So Sanofi and climate is a long journey. So we have been the only pharmaceutical company and the first one present at the COP27 in Paris. And so speaking first about the interconnection between climate and health. At this date, we have decided to reinforce our strategy to mitigate the climate impact on our activities and products. So we have performed a new strategy, and so we have decided to decrease our CO2 emissions. We have relaunched last year a new and more ambitious strategy regarding the way that we can mitigate our emissions. So we have decreased by around 30% CO2 emissions from our activities, and we are committed to tend to carbon neutrality by 2030 and net zero by 2050. We are working on Scope 1, Scope 2, so we have a strong and robust energy efficiency program. We have already switched across the world into renewable energy, so now 60% of our electricity is from renewable and should be largely more by the end of this year. And so we expect by 2025 to have 100% renewable electricity on our activities. We have also implemented a carbon pricing. We have now set up a strategy which is named Carbon Neutral by Design for our new plants, new activities, new manufacturing process. And we worked also with our suppliers, which is very important because in pharma company, Scope 3 is representing around 85% of our CO2 emissions. It's very, very important to engage our suppliers spread across the world to be engaged in a decarbonization trajectory. What we are currently doing for that? So we are not working alone. We are working with other pharma companies in the world because we have mostly the same suppliers, and we have created some coalition with energy suppliers in order to leverage and to collectively strengthen the impact that we can have on our suppliers. Importantly as well, this year we have succeeded to integrate climate change as a risk in the group risk map, meaning that a strong follow-up at the ExCom, so committee executive, with one ExCom member as a sponsor of our climate strategy. What we know recently is that healthcare systems, all the healthcare systems in the world, is representing around 5% of CO2 emission, meaning more than aviation, more than Africa on the whole. Having said that, we know in addition that there is a strong interconnection between climate and health. More and more diseases are coming because of the effect of climate change. Infectious disease, tuberculosis, malaria, dengue, poliomyelitis, but also because of the air pollution, there are more and more respiratory disease, asthma, allergies, unfortunately more and more cancer as well. So we see an increase of the number of diseases in the world. Just one figure. We know that now around 7 million people die each year because of respiratory disease related to climate change, which is huge. 35 million people are dying every year from cardiovascular disease. 28 are in low and middle income countries suffering from climate change. So as a pharma company, we must play our role, and this is where we have worked in order to reshape and revamp our global responsibility to patients and to the environment, and particularly to climate. We have developed a threefold approach. The first one is about mitigation of CO2 emission related to our activities and products. So we are developing tools in order to reduce the climate impact on our products. I spoke about that before, but we have also engaged a new program in order to leverage the impact of climate and health, meaning that we are very well positioned as a pharma company in order to tackle the climate effect on health. meaning that we work on respiratory disease, allergy, asthma, and so on. But we are also strengthening and support the adaptation and resilience of vulnerable population, patients, communities, countries, but also healthcare system and the planet. We are working with a lot of external stakeholders, and so we can detail more later. And this is a way that we want to contribute by working on how we need to innovate to change the design of care, because when you are suffering a disease, your journey to be treated is representing 40% of the healthcare system climate contribution, which is absolutely huge. The third fold, and I will finish by that, is that to complete our approach on mitigation of our activities and products, support of climate and health effect, and for adaptation and resilience to the health effect of climate, we have set up a philanthropic arm with a foundation, which is a Foundation Health, aiming at supporting innovative program, in order to help vulnerable population to become resilient to the effect of climate change. This philanthropic arm is very important because it is an extra mile as a pharma company that we want to develop. And in addition of that, we want to make more noise, if I may say, because in philanthropy, only 2% of the amount of philanthropy are directed to climate change. So it's important also to make more advocacy in order to develop the finance to support resilience of those vulnerable populations. So this is what we are currently doing in decarbonization of the healthcare. Isabelle, what's yours?
Thank you, Sandrine. So Suez has two activities, water and waste. In fact, our core business is, and our purpose is to deliver the essential services to the population and to the communities. Of course, environmental solutions are our DNA, and we are obliged to develop such kind, and we are thrilled to do it. Decarbonization, in fact, is a part of our business and a part of the issue. It's more an enabler to deliver essential services, let's say. Why? Because it's an opportunity. If we want to be affordable in terms of service, we need to be frugal, we need to be more performant, and then we will reduce our carbon footprint. And in terms of decarbonization, we have also an external action, which is to decarbonize our customers and decarbonize the community. How? Just to give you an example, when we take the waste of an industrial company, we participate and we work with them in view to reduce the carbon footprint of his waste. So it's this opportunity, in fact, how we deal with that. The first thing is that we will reduce the energy consumption. We will reduce the reagent consumption. We say reagent, what has to go with carbon footprint? In fact, the carbon footprint of the supplier and the reagent is more, most of the time, than energy for the group. And we will also develop green infrastructure to give access to a low water tariff and a low waste gate fee. This is done thanks to green finance. Two levels for this. The first one, when you have to build infrastructure, you will have you need money, and to capture the green fund, you need to have solutions that are in the NDC as a program of each countries. And in fact, when you read the NDC program of the countries, you find all in front of each a solution from Suez. So then, when you have built the infrastructure, you need to operate it smoothly. Of course, performance, digital solutions, but you have also the carbon credit, and we have developed several solutions that can catch carbon credits and participate to reduce the cost of the services. Just to speak about innovation, in terms of innovation, we think that it's important to be inside the territory, to develop local innovation, fitted with the needs of the customers, the needs of the community, and we develop a strong partnership with local startups, especially in terms of, I have one in mind where we are working with a startup in Ivory Coast to develop micro-methanization of green waste, which is typically subscribed to the climate preservation. Then, if we speak about stakeholders and how we can change the world and change the communities, I give you the floor, Sandrine, to go back with my solution after.
Yes, indeed. So, as you and as Jean-Luc, we can't do it alone. So, decarbonizing healthcare system is not just a matter of pharma companies. In your patient journey, you are facing healthcare professional, you are a patient, you are facing healthcare professional, hospitals, you have insurance, you have governments, you have regulators. All those stakeholders are very important to contribute. And so what we're currently doing under an international approach with a private sector is to engage with other stakeholders. And as you mentioned, it's not one fit for all. We need to adapt and to adjust the way that we want to work. Just illustration, an example. Patients are willing to go to the doctors in order to have a consultation, but if we are moving towards telemedicine, it's a huge, what we call an intervention in order to reduce CO2 emission around 74%, which is absolutely huge. Meaning that we need to change the mindset of patients. We need also to change the patient of healthcare professional in order to say we have no more face-to-face or limited number of face-to-face, which is always important, but we will have an impact and contact through a screen. This is a big change, but it's a huge impact on CO2. It has also social impact because we are looking at decrease the environmental footprint of our activities, but importantly, and this is why we need to work with stakeholders, we need also to assess the social impact. Coming back on telemedicine, we have demonstrated that we can reach more people remotely. People who are living far from hospitals or from cities have now better access to healthcare. But it's also, for example, I mentioned respiratory disease or allergies. People don't want to go to the hospital because it's like a stigma. They are anxious to meet other people. Oh, I have not a good face or things like that. So staying at home, having a consultation directly with professional is absolutely key for them. And so there are more what we call observance of the treatment. So, but it depends on the country where we are. It depends on the culture, and so we need to adapt. We are facing also another, if I may say, concern is about products. When you are eating, if I may say, or taking a medicine, you want the safest as possible. So to do that, we put on the market after having an authorization to put on the market. Medicines are highly regulated. If we want to change something, including the packaging or a comma on the leaflet, we need to go back to the regulators, and it can take months or years in order to have a new authorization. Meaning that, as example, we want to change the packaging of vaccines. It took years in order to make adoption by regulators to change the plastic by cardboard. And this, in each country, we are marketing our products. So we need also to work with regulators to change the mindset in order to accelerate the transition towards decarbonization. So once again, it's a very collective approach. We need also to create the condition of public-private partnership with governments, which is important. So once again, country per country, in order to ensure that it will be efficient. So Jean-Luc, for you, what are your concerns with stakeholders?
Yes, many thanks, Sandrine, Isabelle. And I fully share what you said, and I can illustrate indeed also in our world. How to allow an affordable deployment for decarbonization, and particularly in the sense of affordability, so mostly in developing markets. Our targets can only be achieved with our partners. So decarbonization is a challenge for our sector at large, and we work hand in hand with our ecosystem that goes beyond just the automotive players, such as suppliers and original equipment manufacturer, car or bus or truck or two-wheelers, three-wheelers makers. We strive to secure the support of our customers, and we need to strive this support to build affordable solutions which are suited to the specific context of each region. So also there, I'm going to speak a bit of the whole supply chain that must be on board. We cascade good practices through assessments and support of our suppliers. Companies like us have thousands of suppliers worldwide. We transform our most advanced suppliers into promoters of sustainability in their own network, which even goes beyond automotive, because many of our suppliers are not just supplying our sector. This creates a virtuous circle, allowing us to decarbonize all types of mobility and create new innovative solutions. If you can put a slide back in the slide rack of my slides, we are really engaged in supply chain sustainability into education and deliverables. This is what we are doing, again, if I take the example of India, with the National Association, you have a picture in my slide of the Indian engineers of ACMA, where we have, exactly this one, where we have engaged together with all suppliers a very, very creative exchanges, where I have launched more than 20 audits of tier 2, tier N around India in order to share with them the best practice to decarbonize, particularly, for example, how to do savings in energy consumption, how to respect better the waste and environmental concerns on water usage and remove water overspilling or dirty products, but also to introduce them all the virtues of the life cycle assessment within the industry. And indeed, in the next slide, as you put it here, yes, you can go on the next, we cannot do it particularly as we are a very innovative company worldwide without a staunch belief in international collaborative research, where we engage with several universities, with several think tanks, and also NGOs, namely in Europe, Transport and Environment, but many others worldwide, in strengthening a more sustainable road mobility ecosystem, where we do share with the new players such as Ola in India, Uber worldwide, Didi in China, our best practices for a better road mobility. And there, I also want to follow up in a parallel idea with what Sandrine said about regulation. Not only we are bringing the regulation of decarbonized solution up in the scale of the regulation. As you know, for automotive sector, this happens at UN level, at UNEC in Geneva. It's very much related to COP, which is also a UNFCCC conference. And we are elevated, we are bringing the new countries which are bringing their own regulation in safety and decarbonized solutions up to the regulation level. There, I want to quote two organizations that are very important. One is the OECD practice out of the International Transport Forum, which is the permanent transport forum of the OECD country, plus a few associated countries, such as China, Indonesia, Brazil, and many others. But also the Green Deal of the European Commission, where there is a clear climate diplomacy, where Europe is the benchmark in bringing the regulation up front. So we are also trying to share those best practices and share them with the partners, exactly like we said. And I stop here for the second round of challenges, and I hand over maybe to Isabelle.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. So I will introduce one solution to illustrate what we are doing with the communities and the partners in Suez. We have imagined a solution for the rural area. Of course, as a big company, we are more known for capital cities, large cities or large projects. But it's very important, in fact, for the future to offer essential services to rural area in view to offer a better life of these people in their villages, in their born place. And we were looking of what we can do as Suez for to have a real global infrastructure and service for water and waste for such kind of villages in emerging countries. The subject was that. We have first worked with our suppliers, partner nearby to us in France, in view to have the more sustainable equipment to be provided, more resilient and efficient. And in the meantime, we did an inquiry with local communities to understand what is the key issue for them, especially first in terms of water. Of course, water is a duty, is a woman duty. Each day they have to catch the water, to collect the water, to bring back to the village. It's one of consequence of this duty is that they have no time to go to school. It's so you have a second issue. The water they will collect is not always safe, and there is it is a major cause of disease for children, and in emerging country, because it goes by undrinkable water. So that's the first step. The second step, we know that most of the situations, the water is not good because of fecal contamination. So we need to improve the sanitation in such villages, and it's not like in the city where you have a big pipe to bring the water to the flat and keep back the wastewater back for the treatment. Here you have to imagine something where they have to go and to use it daily, not too far from home, efficient. Second challenge. The third challenge was to have energy. So in emerging country we were dealing with, you have sun, so the first proposal was to equip with solar panels. But we want to have a real green project, so we don't want to have any battery. So that means that you have energy only during the day, so how to do? And then it comes, but in the wastewater treatment today, in the wastewater treatment plant we operate, we generate biogas. And with this biogas, we are doing energy, we are doing gas for domestic use, more elastic. Then when we exchange with our local communities, they said, but you're right. There is a second duty for the woman, the wood duty, because they need to catch wood to do the kitchen, to prepare the food. And we say, but yes, but we can generate biogas. If you bring us your green waste, then we will mix them with the fecal of the sanitation box, and we can have quite a good efficiency in terms of production of biogas. We can produce energy during the night with a genset using biogas to run, or we can deliver gas cooking in a small bottle that you can collect. If you bring your green waste, you can collect a bottle of biogas to do cooking. So we imagine all these projects and working with the communities. We have implemented some pilots. We have, thanks to BPI France, and we have promoted Green Innovation FASEP, which is a supportive system to finance pilots in Benin. And discussing with the water company Soneb in Benin, they have decided where to place this pilot to be more effective. So the first one is currently under implementation in Natitingu in Benin, and we will observe how the communities will run with this pilot, if it is convenient, how to operate it in time, because it's very important to have a dedicated service system to be sure to keep it sustainable in time. Because most of the time you deliver an infrastructure, you come back 2 years after, because you don't have work with the local communities. It's abandoned, it's not used, and the money is wasted. So, sorry. So the idea is to see during this pilot phase how we can manage with the local community to have the most efficient and cheapest service solution. I will show you a small movies with a solution. So that's the illustration, and we are particularly proud, and it's a look back to the, we go back to the climate, because we have received for this project the label of the Bertrand Piccard Foundation Solar Impulse. So this equipment is today labelized with Solar Impulse. Sandrine, if you want to conclude.
So Isabelle, one question. What are the key enablers to make it successful?
I think it's to listen a lot. The local communities, the stakeholders, the public authorities, to lobby also the stakeholder outside of the country, to promote solution to IFIs, to promote solution to foundation, to external, and sometimes to your own company, because it could be a challenge to imagine to deliver water for villages for us. But it's, I think that the first thing for me is listening, exchange, and adapt, be adaptable.
And you, Jean-Luc, what are the key enablers for the success of your project?
Well, for me, there are many issues. First of all, I think it's really the stakeholder approach, exactly like Isabelle and yourself have showed. I think it is extremely important to really rely on the multi-stakeholder approach for getting a sustainability mobility of tomorrow. It's a dialogue with the cities, it's the dialogue with the energy sector, it's the dialogue exactly like Isabelle showed it on the smartness of environment. We had an example of smart village. For us, mobility, it's more concentrated on cities, so I would introduce the concept of smart city. But it is also, I think it's important to remind here this value of the overall ESG community, since today it's also a day dedicated to finance and to the means, and to go for a decarbonized mobility as a goal. This is why I also wanted to introduce the concept of the importance on how the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD, is important for all our rated at the stock exchanges company. If you can show the slide, please, the next slide, where Valeo has issued the first tier 1 supplier worldwide to issue the first climate report. And we did it exactly in building different types of scenario on whether the electrification is going to be on a fast track or if there are going to be some moderation in the deployment, in order to ensure that whatever scenario we're in, the business is sustainable and the path is unstoppable, and that gradually we are, with all the scopes, decarbonizing. And next slide, I think this is the way to ensure the fact of remaining, it's not me saying, it's all the extra financial judging us as the leading supplier worldwide in sustainability. And on the next slide, please, this is how to conclude that we are engaged. If you could put the last slide, on the CAP 50 carbon emission reduction plan is yielding to positive results. What we had to abate is 50 megatons. We have already abated 3.4 megatons between 2019 and 2021. So it's not greenwashing, it's abatement step by step. And we are also calculating avoided emissions thanks to electrification and decarbonization of our products. So these are also methodology that are starting to get recognized by our investors, and we are submitting this to science-based target. It's a overall commitment. We know that road transport needs to deliver and abate the 18% CO2 worldwide for which it is responsible, and we're working on it. And last but not least, indeed, the importance of the talent of the young engineers, technicians. We are fighting like hell to have a more diverse community. We are trying to attract more and more young women. And Egypt, let me conclude with that, is an amazing example with our teams of software engineers that we have built. So we are particularly proud for them in this COP27 to be on the highlights. And I stop here.
So from my part, I fully agree that partnership coalitions are absolutely key for the success of the decarbonation, affordable decarbonation. But also we need to, the clock is ticking. We are coming into a phase that there is an emergency to move forward. That is the reason why awareness is absolutely key, particularly on healthcare system, because it is well known on water, energy, aviation, but less for healthcare system. It's a huge impact finally. So we need to make more noise, to have a strong program of awareness. But in addition of that, it's not just to discuss and to blah, blah, blah. It's to turn ambition and commitment into action and to be on the field, to be close to the communities, to be close of the stakeholders and collectively to move forward. So I think this is a key point that we could have in order to accelerate the transition to decarbonization of healthcare system. Thank you.